ideene våre og produksjonen av ideene våre, så det ikke noe rom for at arbeidere kan skape sin egen frihet. For at de har jo ikke noen egne ideer. De blir hjernevasket av elitene, så at de har ikke mulighet til å skape sine egne ideer som kan frigjøre dem. Sånn at det her motsetningsfylt. Begge deler ikke riktig. Og den samme motsetningen finner du også i media. På den ene siden så får du en sånn slags idé om at media allmektig, om at vi har en slags 1984-tilstand, hvor krig fred, frihet slaveri, og ignoranse styrke. På den andre siden så har du ideen om den fjerde statsmakt, nemlig den om at pressen selve garantisten for at demokratiet kan fungere, som det står i en lærebok som jeg har i undersøkende journalistikk. Og det den ideen prøver å si at media et slags nervesystem for samfunnet som vi lever i. Altså, den skal gi folk en følelse og forståelse av verden. Den skal varsle om farer og problemer, skape en opplyst debatt, slik at vi kan ta best mulig valg i forhold til hvordan samfunnet skal bevege seg. Media skal være kritisk, korrigerende, opplysende og gravende. Og det her også et ideal i stor grad for journalister i Norge. For eksempel den konferansen som samler absolutt flest journalister på et hvert tidspunkt i Norge, det Scoop-konferansen som den heter. Scoop selvsagt et ord for på en måte en stor avsløring, som samler 600-800 journalister hvert år i Tønsberg. Og det her et ideal, nemlig det å grave fram en avsløring. Det et ideal for journalister fra VG til kokkejournalister til biljournalister. Og også blant medieteoretikere så finner du den samme motsetningen. For eksempel så har du propagandamodellen, som en mye brukt modell på venstresiden, og på en måte som en sånn kritisk medieteori, laget av to personer som heter Noam Chomsky og Edward Herman. På den andre siden så har du noe som kalles for kaosparadigme, som har en sånn veldig stor optimisme knyttet nettopp til at vi har nå fått en ny digital teknologi som gir oss selv, som gir vanlige folk en følelse, en mulighet til å kunne bli hørt og nå ut der hvor de ikke før nådde ut. Og for å ta litt om akkurat det kaosparadigmet, så det en fyr som heter Jeff Jarvis, en amerikansk professor i journalistikk, som da uttrykker det på den måten her, i dagens medietilstand, at vi har fått et maktskifte fra topp til bunn, fra senter til periferi, fra dem til oss. Det sånn media ser ut nå. Og vi har selvsagt også i forbindelse med den arabiske våren, så har det blitt forklart at media, og spesielt sosiale medier, spiller en revolusjonær rolle, og at den arabiske våren ville vært utenkelig uten sosiale medier. Så har du en journalist som ganske anerkjent og har stor innflytelse i Storbritannia, som heter Paul Mason. Han har skrevet en bok som heter Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, hvor han også snakker om de sosiale medienes revolusjonære rolle. Og han sier at et nettverk kan vanligvis bekjempe et hierarki. Og det nettverket som man da sikter til, det spesielt Twitter, hvor man kan twittre på en måte radikale, korte meldinger til folk, bidra til å forklare hva som skjer rundt omkring. Du kan fortelle om lokale demonstrasjoner et sted, som folk får høre om et helt annet sted på 0, I den boken som jeg nevnte, så peker han på høye illusjoner nettopp til Twitter. Et problem var at Mason selv faktisk involverte seg i en debatt som foregikk på Twitter, der noen feminister i Storbritannia faktisk foreslo og mente at det var litt sånn patriarkalsk, at det alltid var menn som var figurert på pengesedlene. Så de foreslo at det burde være noen kvinner på de britiske pengesedlene også. Og det skapte en sånn utrolig svær debatt med massevis av såkalte troll som kastet seg inn i debatten med utrolig sexistisk og kvinnehatende retorikk. Og det endte til og med at disse feministene fikk drapstrusler mot seg på grunn av disse forslagene som de hadde fremmet. Hvorpå Paul Mason selv truet med å trekke seg fra Twitter og mente at Twitter nå var blitt ubrukelig etter at på den vendingen som det hadde tatt da. som de sier på engelsk, at ingen piknik uten maur. Og sånn det vel kanskje også med disse her trollene, at når det blir større, du når ut til flere mennesker, så vil du også få troll med på reisen. Og også Twitter blir befolket av folk som slett ikke har noen progressive hensikter med deres tilstedeværelse der. I Norge så har du hatt det avdøde Trond Øgrim, som reiste rundt og holdt frelsesforedrag. Han kom fra AKP ML, ble senere veldig opptatt av ny teknologi og internetteknologi, som reiste rundt nærmest og holdt et frelsesforedrag om internettets kommunistiske potensial, og om hvordan det på en måte var blitt en sånn frigjørende kanal som hadde et revolusjonært potensial. På den andre siden så har du propagandamodellen som jeg nevnte av Chomsky og Herman. Det de gjorde var at de studerte amerikansk mediedekning av Sørøst-Asia og Mellom-Amerika. Og så skrev de boka Manufacturing Consent, som en innflytelsesrik bok som veldig mange radikalere har lest, og som veldig mange folk har brukt som en slags verktøy for å forstå hvordan media fungerer. Der peker de på 5 filtre som bestemmer hva og hvordan nyheter skal rapporteres. Og det de sier der at media dominert av elitene, og de filtrene som de peker på grunnleggende sett det kapitalistisk eierskap, det profittmotivet, bruken av elitekilder og rabiate angrep på de som utfordrer bruken av elitekilder, eller på de som ønsker å ta media i en annen retning enn det elitene vil. Så oppsummert så mener de i den modellen her at mediene strukturert for å kontrollere motstand og styre offentligheten i elitenes interesser. Og igjen i Norge, en person som har vært veldig opptatt av dette her, det en tidligere redaktør av Klassekampen, også som kommer fra den samme bevegelsen som Trond Øgrim, AKP, Sigurd Allern. Han har også skrevet veldig mye om mediekonsentrasjon, og om hvordan det har veldig stor innflytelse på folks tanker. Og det veldig mye sant i den måten. Ingen tvil om at mediene i stor grad blir styrt av elitene. Faktisk så kunne det foredraget her like gjerne hett makt og maktmuligheter i media. Altså det mye maktbruk i media. Og media en maktaktør i seg selv. Du finner mediemoguler, medieeiere og redaktører som absolutt en del av makteliten. Ta bare for eksempel en fyr som Berlusconi i Italia, som vi forhåpentligvis ser slutten, epoke vi forhåpentligvis nå ser slutten på. Eller Murdoch, som gikk på trynet med Be Sky Be og Murdoch telefonavlyttingsskandalene i Storbritannia. Eller en annen fyr, Ted Turner, eller for den saks skyld Mark Zuckerberg, som jo eier Facebook. Og bare for å vise hvor tett på en måte blandet sammen med elitene, medieelitene så bare kan det være litt tålmodig å høre på et par tall her. Under denne telefonhacking-skandalen som jeg akkurat nevnte, så kom det etter hvert fram at Scotland Yard på den tiden da det viste seg at Murdoch Media hadde tappet og avlyttet massevis av kjendiser og andre sårbare, så hadde de hatt 18 middager. Scotland Yard-ledelsen hadde hatt 18 middager med Murdoch og hans redaktører, og på samme tiden nektet de å sette i gang en etterforskning. Mens Murdoch selv, han har hatt 113 middager. Det noen som har forsket på dette her. Han har hatt 113 middager, kanskje noen uoffisielle også som han ikke har fått med seg, med statsledere og opposisjonsledere siden 1988. Mens David Cameron, som statsminister i England, har hatt 75 møter med mediefolk i den korte perioden fra mai 2010 til juli 2011. Jeg sier noe om hvor tett det forholdet Og hvis du ser på internett i dag, så det ingen tvil om at Altså, internettet en maktkamp, en slags kapitalistisk maktkamp som foregår på internettet, og du kan nesten bruke en slags sånn imperialisme-lignende metafor, hvor store konserner som Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple sitter på hvert sitt kontinent, og så kjemper de om makten. Og så sitter de der med hver sin base, og så prøver de å erobre større territorium på internett, og prøver å kjempe mot å bli erobret fra andre. Det en slags episk historie om krigende klaner i et underlig og stadig endrende landskap. En historie om invasjoner og beleiringer, om skumle plots og bedrag, om briljans på slagmarken eller om flaks. En slags high-tech-versjon av Battle of Thrones. Der får du liksom hele tiden rapportert om hvordan disse her store selskapene kjemper med hverandre. Utvilsomt eierskap viktig over internettet, og det langt fra Trond Øgrims kommunistiske internett, det som vi ser i dag. I tillegg så også selvsagt mediene svært ideologiske, og du finner en rekke ideer om nasjonalisme som tas for gitt, eller klassesamfunnet som tas for gitt, i at noen rike milliardærer, og det digger seg opp under sånne rike milliardærer sine fester og liv og leven, mens fattigdommen og på en måte klasseskillene tas for gitt. Vi finner ideer med sexisme, rasisme, innvandringsfiendtlighet, kroppspress. Og VG gir selvsagt aldri fra seg en mulighet til å vise fram noen nakne kropper, bare for å ta dagens VG. De lurte sine ofre med kroppen som våpen. Sexspionene les om de største honningfelleskandalene. Eller her har vi Dagens Næringsliv. Familien ser frem til at de får en mer anonym toppjobb. Det sjef Helge Lund i Statoil som nå skal få en ny lønn på 190 millioner kroner de neste 5 årene. Det Askeladden som går ned i solnedgangen til en lykkelig historie. Null kritikk der. Og det helt åpenbart at eliten avhengig av media for å overføre. Bare for å ta under Irak-krigen så var det enorme protester over hele verden mot en kommende krig i 2003 i Irak. Og hva skjedde? I Murdochs aviser, for den saks skyld også VG, så var det samtlige av hans 175 aviser utenom. I alle land var det enorm motstand mot den krigen her, men i samtlige av hans aviser så støttet de Irak-krigen. Noe som sier noe om gapet mellom folkeopinionen og det som blir sagt i avisene. Og for den saks skyld så ser vi Assange-avsløringene av NSA, amerikanske overvåkningsorganisasjonen, så ser vi hvordan også nettet blir brukt for å konsolidere kontrollen og makten over folk, over oss da. Samtidig så det min mening at denne såkalte propagandamodellen blir litt for statisk, eller funksjonalistisk, som det også heter, at den blir på en måte, den går inn og ser hvordan media fungerer, og den skaper et inntrykk av at media alltid blir styrt ovenfra, at det nesten totalitært. Men det som jeg mener viktig å si at media ikke en monolitt, og den ikke uten splid, og det ikke alltid konsensus i de ulike mediene. Den ikke immun, journalister og mediene ikke immun mot sosiale bevegelser eller nye ideer som utfordrer maktstrukturene. Og det litt viktig å ha med seg dette her, så at man ikke så blir fullstendig defaitist eller fullstendig pessimist i forhold til mediene. For å gi dere nok en gang noen eksempler. Så har vi jo, I Norge så har vi for eksempel en avisen her, Le Monde Diplomatique, som jo et unntak, eller for den saks skyld Klassekampen, som jo ikke hører til de dominerende mediene. Men du finner også i vanlige medier, så finner du bra avslørende journalistikk, som faktisk prøver å leve opp til det 4. statsmaktidealet. Her i Aftenposten, IOC blir grunnlagt for å fremme fred, siden OL-historien fylt av maktkamp, luksus og penger under bordet. Eller her, Skipsted ser deg, Norges største medieselskap, samlet 136 000 opplysninger om en person på hvor de viser disse her metadataene, om hvor stor kontroll og hvor mye informasjon de faktisk sitter på om oss. Så du finner også en kritisk rolle der. Og under Irak-krigen, for eksempel i Storbritannia, så kjørte Daily Mirror, de kjørte en flere uker lang kampanje, altså dette en avis med 5 millioner lesere, hvor de satte av de 6 første sidene til kritikk mot den kommende Irak-krigen. Forsidene var hver dag viet kritikk mot den kommende Irak-krigen, mot USAs og Englands imperialisme. De hadde for eksempel en sak hvor de sa Tony Blair has blood on his hands, og så kjørte de fram statsminister Blair med blod på hendene. Det var den type saker som var veldig radikale, som de kjørte dag ut, dag inn i Daily Mirror. I Norge så hadde du selvsagt VG, som var fullstendig overbevist om Powell Show. På den andre siden så hadde du Dagsavisen, som var langt mer skeptisk og kritisk til den fremstillingen. Og årsaken til hvordan det kan være sånn at du ser en sånn type splid, for det mener jeg en splid som du finner, det ikke en altomfattende og dominerende som vi ser. Og årsaken til at det kan være sånn, det bunner i reelle og materielle motsetninger som finnes i kapitalismen. Kapitalismen det første økonomiske systemet som revolusjonerende i forhold til produksjon. Den skaper ny teknologi, nye bevegelser, som skaper reelle motsetninger, nye ideer, en ny utvikling, som gjør at det skapes rom hvor det ikke en helt klar sikkerhet rundt hvordan man skal tolke nye ting som skjer hele tiden. Og for det andre så det også sånn at elitene også heller ikke alltid står sammen. Selvsagt i stor grad så har de klasseinteresser med hverandre, men det finnes også mellom de ulike elitene. De ikke alltid samlet for å ta Irak-krigen igjen. Så var det selvsagt en strid mellom de irakiske og de amerikanske elitene. Det var åpenbart sånn at de irakiske elitene ikke hadde lyst til å bli bombet av de amerikanske, eller de vestlige. Men også, du så det også i FN, hvordan gamle Europa stod mot nye Europa, og hvordan helt opp til FN-nivå var en splid og en uenighet om hvordan man skulle forholde seg til Midtøsten. Eller i Norge for den saks skyld. I den norske regjeringen på det tidspunktet så var det sånn at Bondevik, presset av kirken, igjen presset av antikrigsbevegelsen, som gikk i tusentall i gatene, ønsket å forlate krigen, at Norge ikke skulle delta i Irak-krigen. Pettersen, som var representert av Høyre og som var utenriksminister på det tidspunktet, ville gjerne at Norge skulle fortsette å delta i Irak-krigen. Alt annet som høyrefolk sier i dag løgn. Det var sannheten. Og så endte det med at Bondevik fikk trumfet gjennom sin vilje, og Norge trakk seg ut av Irak-krigen. Så det illustrerer at det en splid blant elitene, og det her skaper også en åpning nedenfra som gjør at folk kan komme inn med andre ideer. Og det sånn at enkelte hendelser de viser defekter ved systemet, de viser hykleriet, løgnene og de nakne klasseinteressene til dem som sitter på toppen. Og det skaper en mulighet til mobilisering som vi kan bruke. Og dessuten så kan den type, på en måte, også den type kampanjer som Daily Mirror kjørte i sin tid, faktisk også være profitable. De tjente faktisk penger på det, for at de traff folkeopinionen. Det var faktisk en profitabel kampanje. Noen av dere har kanskje også sett for eksempel TV-serien The Wire. Det en profitabel TV-serie som svært kritisk til politiet, til korrupte fagforeninger, til skolesystemet, til hvordan den amerikanske staten blir styrt. Men de har funnet en businessmodell for å vise den type ting, og det blir vist av store kommersielle amerikanske interesser, fordi at de vet at det når frem til folk. Folk ser at kapitalismen har shortcomings, eller altså at den har problemer, og den type TV-serier kan nyte stor suksess. Derfor så mener jeg at propagandamodellen til Chomsky-Herman nødt til å suppleres med en modell av en spansk sosiolog som heter Manuel Castells, som snakker om mediene som en slags plattform for ulike sosiale, økonomiske, motsetningsfylte interesser. At mediene en kamp, det en kampplattform, hvor ulike interesser kjemper seg vei inn i spaltene. Du har ulike politiske partier, de ønsker å komme inn ved hjelp av sine informasjonsmedarbeidere og så videre. Så kjemper de seg inn i spaltene, der har de motsetninger. Du har ulike økonomiske interesser som kjemper om å komme inn og ha innflytelse, makt, og sette agendaen, få økt status og så videre inn i spaltene. Og du har sosiale interesser som fagbevegelsen, som har jo et helt korps av informasjonsmedarbeidere for å nå inn i mediene med sine interesser og sin forståelse av virkeligheten. Sånn at det foregår hele tiden en tankekrig om hvordan samfunnet skal organiseres og beskrives, om hva som mulig eller umulig. Og det som skjer at ulike grupperinger prøver å overbevise publikum om at deres ideer mer gyldig enn rivalenes ideer. Generelt så mener jeg man kan si om media at den reflekterer en slags sånn bondevett, sånn common sense som det heter på engelsk, i motsetning da til den sunne fornuften som kanskje et par av disse forsidene her viste, som prøver å finne det beste i oss, som prøver å finne de beste ideene som ønsker å være kritisk og ta verden fremover. Og det den sunne fornuften, det media som på en måte reflekterer en sunn fornuft. Det den som vi ønsker å ha mer av. Så generelt så kan du sammenligne internettet kan du sammenligne med en slags by. Den fylt av butikkvinduer, gateskilter, du kan kjøpe varer og tjenester, du en konsument som kan gå rundt og leve lykkelig hvis du har nok penger. Men det finnes også åpne plasser og torg hvor du kan okkupere, hvor du kan gå inn og ta din egen plass, sånn som Indignados-bevegelsen gjorde i Spania for eksempel. Og sånn også internett. Det også en mulighet, et sted med muligheter for å slå seg frem. Og det noe av det som vi, for å komme tilbake til Radikal portal, det noe av det som vi ønsket med Radikal portal. På det tidspunktet som vi lanserte Radikal portal, så vi at det ikke egentlig fantes noen mediekanal i Norge som satset å bruke radikale ideer på internett. Du hadde Klassekampen, som jo en bra avis på papir, men som av realøkonomiske årsaker ikke satser noe på internettet. Vi trenger en sånn kanal på nettet i Norge for å på en måte støtte opp under og hjelpe fram ulike sosiale interesser, miljøbevegelsen, antirasister, feminister og fagforeningsfolk som vil slåss for et mer rettferdig og egalitært samfunn. Vi ønsket å ta side, vi ønsket å være partiske. Vi prøver ikke late som om vi noe annet enn det vi Vi mener at det nødvendig å ha en sånn publikasjon også på nett i Norge, og det noe av hensikten med Radikal portal. For eksempel i Danmark så har du tilsvarende Motkraft og TK. I Sverige så har du noe som heter Dagens etc. Faktisk den første papiravisen som lansert i Sverige på 30 år. For nå har de har vært på nettet lenge, og de har hatt ukesavis og tidsskrift og magasin før det. Nå har de lansert seg som dagsavis, men de også veldig offensive på nettet. Eller du har også en annen kanal som heter politism.se. I USA så har det en rekke av den type, for eksempel Jacobin da, der. Vi har, siden vi ble lansert, så har vi hele tiden vokst noe av det som blir beskrevet i forhold til Jacobin her. Og de siste tallene med 180 000 treff som vi hadde nå i oktober måned nok den absolutt beste måneden. Og det synes vi selv veldig bra, gitt at Norge et land med 5 millioner mennesker, og ikke en engelsk publikasjon som kan nå frem til et verdenspublikum, så synes vi det å få 180 000 klikk, eller 140 000 mennesker som går inn på nettsidene, så når vi faktisk ut til ganske mange. Men vi har selvsagt lyst til å bli mye bedre. Vi publiserer hver dag. Vi sampubliserer, har mange ganger sampublisert med både Aftenposten, med Dagbladet, VG og noen få ganger med Klassekampen. Så vi ønsker også å nå fram til de større mediene, og vi ikke noe redde for å gjøre det. Vi ønsker å nå fram med ideene våre, rett og slett. Og vi skyr ikke de større mediene bare fordi at de også har reaksjonære ideer. Sånn at det liksom agendaen vår. Så hvis noen her har lyst til så de hjertelig velkomne til å komme bort til meg etterpå og snakke om det. Takk.
Thank you. I'll be a few minutes to start the discussion, and then we'll open questions from the audience. First, I would like to pose a question that, well, while the internet, it makes it possible to spread ideas in a way that we never have seen before, and we can draw the parallel between the internet and the invention of the printing press. But what happened when the printing press was invented wasn't that people got enlightened, well, just like that. What happened was actually that we got a lot of wars, religious wars over different views. What we see with the internet today is like, is it really giving us a way to spread a lot, like to be enlightened, to get a lot of good, neutral or truthful information about the world? Or are we just sitting on our turfs and reading what we want to read and reading what suits our views? So is it leading to more fragmentation or an internal division, or what role does internet or other media channels play today? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, so I think the safest answer to any question like that is always just to say that the technology itself is largely neutral. It's a politics, the political climate that we have, so the technology will just amplify whatever political trends or currents that we have to begin with. In fact, though, I think that to the extent one has to, would have to pick a side, I would say that the internet has actually promoted certain models of feelings of global solidarity and I hate to use the word, but even global citizenship in such a way that, when there was the insurgency in Ferguson after the shooting of a young black youth in the city, there was messages of solidarity between those in Palestine and those in Ferguson. When the Arab Spring happened, there was a sense of, I think, a broader awareness of the ways in which our struggles are related and we're facing against similar police brutality and oppression and exploitation. And I think the internet is a facilitator of that. And I think it has been broadly useful in that sphere. So I veer on the side of optimism there. But of course, with any technology, it really just depends on the wider political currents, the way it's used and its impact.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to answer, Vegard?
Yeah, I think the internet gives us lots of opportunities to get out to people on the left or through organizations that don't have a lot of money. Undoubtedly, the distribution and the production costs are much lower than if we, for instance, wanted to make a paper magazine, and that costs a lot of money both to produce and to distribute. So we've gotten a new channel now, which has the opportunity to reach a lot of people that aren't easily available in other ways. And it can be, for instance, it can be a launch pad like for the Jacobin magazine. A good net magazine, net page can be a launch pad for other types of activities, for instance, publishing or reading, even reading groups that Jacobin has, or for paper magazines that they have. So when you first reach a lot of people and you get known, then you have a launch pad for doing lots of other stuff that you didn't have before. But what we have to know also is that the same unevenness that you see in the rest of society is being reproduced in the internet. So, for instance, I've seen statistics for Twitter users, and it says that 50% of the users of Twitter makes 0.05%. Or 0.0% of the users on Twitter makes 50% of the traffic on Twitter. And of course the users there are dominantly from the West, and most of the tweets that you tweet never has any resonance at all. I've seen 71% of the tweets that are being tweeted don't have any publishing at all. And of course it's the same large companies that you see outside of the internet that also are large and dominant on the internet. So I think we are far away from the internet being a free open space. And you can even see through Facebook and the NSA monitoring, you can see that, and surveillance, you can even see that maybe even capitalist control of our lives are being strengthened than it used to be.
Thank you. Another question is to follow up on what you said, Bhaskar, about using your Jacobin as a channel for mobilization, and that is not only about representing different views, but also to inspire others to come over to engage in the socialist movement in a way. And what I wonder about then is that on the internet you compete with so many other things that people can watch and view. And for example, in Norway, one of the top things that people read are the pink bloggers or some lifestyle consumerist blogs instead of maybe news. And how do you break through the noise? And do you have examples of how you have contributed to building a movement?
Well, so basically, part of what I meant is that, let's say Jacobin, for instance, has a paywall, but we barely use it. 95+% of our articles are available online for free immediately the same day it's released. So there's actually limited benefit in being a digital subscriber or anything like that for Jacobin. So despite the fact that our audience is growing, we could imagine a scenario where we cut down on our total number of audience a little bit, and we wouldn't have any financial impact from that because we're not advertisement driven. So it doesn't matter how many impressions we get. And actually bring in a lot more revenue because we would convert more of those people into subscribers. If our goal was like, a capitalist media outlet, if our goal was maximizing the amount of money we're bringing in, but obviously we have very different goals. But I think that it's not really that difficult to win over people's attention. Generally, when you're making a publication, you don't try to think, this is what people want to read, so we're going to produce this, because then you'll just end up looking like every other lowest common denominator publication in that sphere. You have to kind of do your own interesting thing and hope that it's either not so similar to everything else, that it's lost in the shuffle, and also that it's not so weird and eccentric that only you and your small group of friends would like it. So anywhere in that middle ground, you'll probably generate an audience. But in general, people are really interested in their lives, in the processes and structures that condition their lives. People are by nature political. And one of the reasons why in the mainstream media they often talk about how, especially youth, are apolitical or apathetic, but this is just a response to the fact that they're not seeing voices and political alternatives they actually have faith in and that they think can actually manufacture change in their lifetimes. So I think that once we put forward a publication that's explicitly radical, but also that doesn't itself to immediate demands and the struggle for reforms in pursuit of deeper transformations. Once we do that, we actually realize that there's a lot of people who have been waiting for outlets like this. There's a lot of people who want change. As far as building a movement, a publication can't manufacture a movement by itself, but we look to see where there's vibrancy, where there's activity, and also where we could be useful. So Jacobin is well read in the Palestinian solidarity movement on campuses in the United States, which is one particular area of vibrancy. We have a base among dissident caucuses within trade unions and also directly with the Chicago Teachers Union and also the Teachers Union in Los Angeles. So where there is activity, we try to be useful. But the whole point of actually having democratic mass movements is that these movements, which will take shape, might completely disagree with the ideas I put forward and the ideas that Jacobin would put forward, and we would respect that disagreement and still support those movements because by nature we fight for as much democracy as possible at every level.
Okay, I think I'm going to open for questions from the audience. Yeah, please come up here so you can speak in the microphone. Yeah, you can come first.
Hi. I have a question about internet is not a neutral media somehow because it changes our brain. So there are discussions about that using internet, using lots of pictures instead of texts, short formats change our ability to concentrate, change our ability to focus on things, to understand complex issues. For instance, Manfred Spitzer is publishing a book in Norway now the next days, I think, who is collecting evidence about this. I would like to have a comment. Do you see this effect? Do you have discussed this effect in your networks?
Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't have any statistics on it, but I think probably it's true that people's span is being shortened, and that and also I have 2 kids, and I constantly have to remind myself not to to pull up the iPhone or to check out what happens on the platform there, and to try and concentrate on real life around me instead of the constant need or the wish for checking out what's happening. So I think I don't have the statistics for the concentration span, but there are coming more and more science on that now, and probably it's true. But I think it's important to try and for all of us to try and to say no. For instance, when I go on vacation, I see this says free Wi-Fi zone. It says, I think in a few years probably it's going to see Wi-Fi free zones. Because we're getting more and more conscious about the dangers for using the internet all the time.
So I somewhat disagree in that I think that, for example, let's say when we talk about how ideas were propagated on the left, let's say, in a certain span of the 20th century, especially in intellectual circles, we're talking about a particular form of, let's say, the long-form essay, and before that, the polemical political book. And you could say that, okay, there's less people interested in that kind of material today. Therefore, people's attention spans are going, they're less interested in serious ideas, and their ability to affect change is thus less. But if you put in some sort of historical context, this period where we're actually seeking to persuade people through the written word is obviously just a blip in the grand period of human political activity and change. Most people have always been stirred more by oratory and speech, an art that we've lost on the left. It used to be that even in places like New York that never were particularly radical at the turn of the 20th century, on street corners, one of the first things that young Socialist Party or Communist Party cadre would learn is how to stand on a soapbox in Union Square or elsewhere and just deliver a speech. And sometimes there would be no one that would come around them, and if they were particularly good, there would be a crowd that would start to assemble and whatnot, and that was a primary way of actually speaking to people and communicating to people. So, in other words, if there is, and I don't have the stats, I don't know, but if there is a shift away from long form and other traditional things, I don't think we should fetishize these forms. We should think about how to adapt to the new ones and inject political content and vitality in whatever new forms are prominent. Because as a left, we're so small, we're unable to actually influence these wider trends, much less the trend of capitalist technology and mass communications and whatnot. So we kind of have to go with the changes and be actually the first to adapt and innovate and thrive in the new environment.
Yeah. Ifit, do you want to come up?
I'm going to try and keep this short. I used to write articles in the newspapers here in Oslo. I was labelled a radicalist, right? And then I started Humans of Oslo, and I found out that I was reaching out to more people by not mentioning anything to do with politics, but my message was the same, which is that we're all the same. So what my focus here is about the power of words, and the fact that you both mentioned the fact that you are reaching out to the left, and that you say yourself that you're radical. For me, what you guys are talking about is the truth. So are we not like losing more people when we focus on the word radical to define who we are? I mean, you're talking about reaching out to the left, but the left is already on your side. they'll reach out and find you anyway. It's not possible to find kind of like a middle road, so then we also get people on the right to come over to the left. And the other thing is that, oh yeah, I just did both. That was quite good. It's probably the shortest I've ever done ever. All right, okay, that was just those two questions.
Who wants to answer that?
Well, obviously, you know, at a left gathering, I might be more explicit about, you know, some of the ideology and the framing, but for most of the people who read Jackman, they don't really care. They care about the particular article and the particular point being made in the article. So we obviously don't laden our prose with too much jargon or shorthand, you know, so we do strive, obviously, to make sure that people who aren't familiar with these ideas are going to be able to immediately grasp them, and also we have faith in people's ability to see how these arguments you know, coincide with their lived experience, and that's the reason why they support them, not from some sort of a priori you know, ideology. But that said, the reason why I think it's important to openly label ourselves and place ourselves within a political tradition is that this is the framework from which we connect to the past and also the future. This is the framework from which we obviously strive for some sort of political consistency. And the political consistency is rooted in the fact that I think one needs to be open that that even though our average reader might now just be getting introduced to these ideas, it's important that once they're introduced to these ideas, they actually see the ways in which things are connected. And they actually are introduced to a moral and ethical critique of capitalism. And these are things you can't kind of bury or trick people. So in other words, I think it's actually more honest to come forward and say, we're a socialist venue, this is where we stand, this is broadly what we agree in, and we hope that, you know, if you find this analysis compelling, you yourself would identify as a socialist and participate in the emerging movements under this banner. And I think, if anything, the alternative is obviously just to think that we could trick or con people into a certain set of politics without even having the ideology. So I actually think it's more honest and actually more compelling to ordinary people to just be out front for us to say that we're a partisan outlet and venue without any, you know, notion of false notion of objectivity or whatnot.
Also, we say that we are partisan, and we do take sides, but we don't say that we are the left, even though many of our writers and organizers are on the left. And also, if you see who we reach out to, 140,000 people, it's a lot, or 180,000 people this month. It's far. The trade union movement, which of course counts lots of more people, and we try and bring in ordinary stories. We even try and reach out to people who vote for other parties than the left through ordinary stories that people can generalize on people that are being kind of stampled over by the system in different ways. We for instance, had a writing competition that said, "Are women free now?" Where we didn't explicitly say that this is did feminism succeed now? We didn't call it did feminism succeed now? We called it "Are women free now?" because in the 70s that was of course the goal, that women should free themselves through women's liberation. And so we asked questions: Are women in Norway free now? And we had lots of contributions from people ordinary people who I don't think looked at themselves as being from the left, who talked about their own situation, and who reached out to a lot of people, even through the main papers. Published, I think, 4 of those contributions that we got in there. So we try and reach out to a lot of other people, and we do have a consciousness about that, even though we do try and take the debates about the way forward for the left, for Socialist Leftist Party, for the Red Party, and so on also.
Thanks. Now we have 3 speakers lined up. First, the one in the red shirt, and I think that the two others you can come up as well so that we can make it a little bit faster. Four speakers.
Hi, hello. My name is Albert Andersen Edvin. I'm a student of sociology, and I am a member of the Socialist Left Party in Norway. And I want to pick up on Vegard's Marx quotes from the beginning a little bit, because I've been reading a little bit about Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, and his idea of hegemony, how there's a class-based hegemony that defines the ideas of a society. And I think it's possible to create a counter-hegemony in a way, because power isn't absolute and all-controlling and dominating within society. But he also writes a lot about that counter-hegemony needs to come from below, that it needs to come from the working class itself, and how you need to create organic intellectuals, so from the socialist movement or from the working class movement themselves, and not from the traditional academic circles. But the profession of journalism and also the participation in social media is a very middle-class academic-based arena, I think, today. So my question is, how do you create the organic journalists?
Well, I think that part of it is in our relationship to socialist parties and movements as they emerge, and also with the broader workers' movement. So let's say, like, sociologically, Jacobin, compared to relative to other venues and journals on the left, does have more people from a working class background, more people from immigrant or less privileged background. But by that self, that doesn't mean that this is so-called organic intellectuals in the mold that Gramsci meant, because obviously there is no massive militant movement that are actually producing intellectuals in the same way. So in other words, one of the first acts, even if you're from a working class background, of actually finding the left is kind of moving away from the prevailing mainstream political politics and into the left. So if anything, it's not even that action, even if sociologically you're from the working class, it's not quite the same as an organic intellectual. And that's one of the reasons why liberal narratives around privilege and access kind of miss some of that. But obviously, one can't manufacture a movement, but if you say that the relationship between ideas like this from above and ideas like this from below, I mean, not to fall back on an old, the old Marxist cliche, but the relationship is, of course, dialectical, where we could do our parts supporting movements from below, even if we're fully aware that we're representing only a small socialist sliver of a small, broader progressive movement. But I do think part of this actually relies on how one relates to the existing parties and organizations and social forces. So this is one of the debates that we've had on the American left for a long time, when actually Appeal to Reason, for instance, that I mentioned a lot in my talk, actually wanted to be an official organ of the Socialist Party. But the party, even though it was, grew in conjunction with Appeal to Reason, actually rebuffed them many, many times on part of the ideas that if you gave, you put up a powerful newspaper that actually generated lots of revenue in the control of the party, it would just be fuel for factional fights. And this is one of the reasons why it eventually moved rightward and took a lot of the socialist movement with it, because it was under no democratic control. So obviously these are kind of debates that one needs to reconcile, like how do you manufacture a culture of intellectuals? How does the papers relate to parties and organizations? But they're obviously not particularly relevant questions for us at the moment, at least in the American context.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and a question that we try and have a conscious relationship to, because in the first place, when we established ourselves, we did say that we do take sides. We are partisan. in the social struggles. We do take sides for environmental movements, for feminists, and so on that I mentioned. Also, we recruit from those movements to our editorial board, writers, people who are active in different ways in Radical Portal. We try and bring in those people and try and create an environment where we try and have progressive ideas. And also, we do take sides in different conflicts. For instance, now there's a strike amongst dock workers in Norway, where there has been several occupations and strikes on the docks, and we are there with them. Some of our editorial members have been imprisoned with the dockers when they have been reporting and taken photographs. And we are there, and we have even contributed to mobilization, not only through reporting, but also took, for instance, the initiative now to a demonstration outside of the library in Oslo against a Swedish Nazi artist whose ideas were going to be shown at a meeting at the library. So we do try and show in different ways that we take sides.
Okay, thank you. We now have 4 minutes left and only 10 minutes, so I encourage you to be short and also for the answers to be short. Thank you.
My name is Joachim Möllers, and I'm an editorial board member of Radical Portal, by the way. I just wanted to have a quick commentary on what Radical Portal is, because until now there are no people getting any wages or anything, so it's 100% purely, it's pure activism, and it's very important so also like the dynamics between us and the rest of the activists in Norway and the society of activists, or whatever we should call it, is extremely important. And a comment on our guests here, what he said about like academics and working class. We also have very we have people from all backgrounds. Now we're starting to educate people to become journalists, people who are, whatever. If you're an historian or a dock worker or whatever, you can come to us, you can write your own news. But I wanted to ask a question to our guest here, because we at Radical Portal, we had a lot of people who can write text and who are to contribute to get stuff out. But we have some more problems of getting volunteers in the technical side, and so I think my personal opinion of our own site is that it doesn't look as good as it can. Your site looks quite amazing, I think, and I just want to ask you what do you think the importance of that is? Because I don't know. I think maybe that if you don't look good, maybe you're not taken as seriously as you would like to.
Right. Well, I think form actually does matter a ton, because it also shows that you're serious and accessible, and that So we're basically trying to, with Jacobin, get away from the old New Left aesthetics of black and courier, that kind of like lithograph printed flyers. And actually look, vibrant and open and more exciting. We also avoid a lot of traditional left imagery, so we don't use any red stars or hammer and sickles and whatnot. We kind of develop our own iconography. That's also, we have a Toussaint logo, so it's also very radical, but it's just different, and it's not, nostalgic. Like, I love Soviet agitprop as much as anyone else, but like we've kind of copied that style of early 1920s Soviet agitprop for like everything on the left, and hopefully we could move away from it. But so basically, I think that Jacobin for a long time was volunteer only. I don't take a salary, but I don't really think that any of that's necessarily anything that that is particularly a good thing. So not even in the self-interested way, I just mean in general. Because part of the reason why now we have 3 to 4 paid staff is that you could actually rationally allocate and balance work burdens, and it just like you're more effective. But for us, the first place that we invested was in actually hiring a designer and having good web programmers and whatnot. And they're all leftists, so they'd be willing to do it for free, but we gave them stipends for it anyway. Because the difference is obviously they're all the more punctual and serious if they're actually getting something and they're showing that their work is appreciated. But I think it all goes hand in hand. Like in every other publication in the country, just to be really brief, that's at our size of circulation, has dedicated list managers. So you pay a company $1,000 a month, let's say, to manage your subscriber list and so on. We don't pay anyone because our back end can handle that. We do that those processes, so much of our circulation, like 70–80% is all automated. So in other words, we have a more advanced paywall and more automated systems than even large publications like the New Republic. So that's, I think, because we're so aware of the effects of tailorization, we know how to tailorize ourselves well, and I think things like that are actually important. Beyond just mere aesthetics, I think it's important to actually building any sort of publication. We have the fact that we have an ideology that isn't very popular at the moment stacked against us, so we need to actually be more effective and productive and serious than the mainstream forces that have more resources than us.
Okay, I think we go to the next question.
Hello, my name is Aslak. I'm editor of Sosialistisk Framtid, which we sell downstairs. I have a question about what Vegard talked about and like the power structures in the media. I just read in Dagbladet that it had been exposed that the CIA had paid some people in Miami to write negative articles about Cuba. Every time before Norway or its allies go to war, or we support a coup d'état like in Ukraine, the media coverage are always so extremely biased, and sometimes also we publish lots of false accusations against those we don't like. And my question is, do you think that like the military CIA actually has influence over the editorial by producing false news? There was also in Germany a journalist that claimed that he had been paid by the CIA to write lies. And how can you be critical to such power structures without becoming a conspiracy theorist, which I think is important to avoid?
Thank you.
Well, the short answer is no. I don't think that. I read the article that you mentioned about the German editor, ex-editor, that had been paid by the CIA or whoever in the US to place articles in magazines that were US friendly and so on. And undoubtedly that has happened, and maybe it even happens today. I don't know, but I don't think that's even though it happens. I don't think that's the main explanation or the most important explanation why Norwegian media is US friendly. You don't need to go to the media to see a Norway which is US friendly. Just go to the Labour Party. Even in the Socialist Leftist Party now, there is a debate whether one should be against or pro NATO, where the deputy leader says that we should put the struggle of NATO behind us. So I mean. So I think the main reason why it's just become common sense in the media that the West and the US is our allies, and the default mode in the media is if in doubt, support the US. If in doubt, you support the Norwegian politicians who support the US. But there are examples, of course, where there are cracks and where there opens up possibilities for critical or radical movements that do throw those politicians' judgments in doubt, or who can move against it. And those moments, there are such moments in the media where also the media can be radical, and those are the moments that we are looking for to mobilize against. But I think that one should know that the default mode of the Norwegian media is not any more radical than Norwegian politics or Norwegian scientists in that case in general, which is not anti-US and so on. So I don't think you should have any big illusions about the press being any more radical than the rest of Norway or the rest of the establishment.
Do you also want to respond to this, or should we move on?
Yeah, since we don't have much time, I won't respond too much, but I think there's an old Gore Vidal quote about the ruling class that basically says that part of the success of the ruling class is that a lot of the ruling class doesn't even know the ruling class. So a lot of the media doesn't even know that it's reproducing dominant ideas. So as an alternative press in the United States, we veer on the side of, we are stridently anti-imperialist. We reject every single U.S. intervention there ever was, and we continue to on, political principles. That said, I don't think a lot of these things are the result of CIA machinations. A lot of times it's just, even in situations, let's say Ukraine, the domestic ruling classes are capable of having their own battles, and some will take the side of the Russians, some will take the side of NATO, and it's a little bit too simplistic to reduce it all to just the role of the United States in those circumstances. But if in doubt, blame the U.S. I think that's a fine motto for us to have.
Hi there. Well, I don't write for anyone, but I have a question about the other radical media, and then I mean the far right, because we've talked about whether the internet is like a neutral playing field. And one thing that I have noticed is, this is not an original observation, is basically the BuzzFeedization of how articles are created. And I have noticed that the far right are very good at BuzzFeedization. You talked about 100,000 subscribers. There's a Facebook group in Sweden called We Who Say No to Free Driver's Licenses and Other Particular Rights to Newly Arrived Immigrants. This is based on one article in a far-right magazine. And that was basically the title, which said that, well, immigrants get free driver's licenses when they get here. Isn't that, crazy? And of course they don't, because, well, they just don't. And like lots of energy has been devoted to that, but that's a real misconception, and it goes around, and 50,000 people have joined that Facebook page. They daily get new information about the horrors of immigrants and whatever they do, etc., etc. This is, as I said, from one article in this. They are very good at the BuzzFeedization of articles. And I have noticed that the left don't do this to the same extent, which I think is very good. It was actually lampooned in these times, who had something like, "You won't believe what Marx said about the banks," something like that. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about the challenge of how to counter those kinds of like pure, constant mass misinformations, which are just play wrong, and like how to also handle the temptation to try to do the same thing but in a left-wing costume. Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first, you get the last word. I think that, so it's very easy to organize capitalists for capitalists, or people in favor of the dominant system. So if racism and anti-immigrant sentiments serve the interests of a lot of controlling interests in, let's say, Sweden, it's very easy to just tag along. If I was a libertarian publisher instead of a socialist publisher, I would be given a similar talk in a much different place, but I'm sure the numbers would be 10, 20 times inflated compared to Jacobin's reach and size, because it's easy to organize capitalists for capitalists. But I do think that when it comes to actually the BuzzFeedification of the internet, I think that phrase is actually something that the liberals use a lot. And I think it's one that we should avoid, because our content should just be just as compelling, and it should stimulate people at an emotional, visceral level the same way this far-right content does. The only difference is there's a fine line. We shouldn't fall into cheap demagoguery or shortcuts in any case, but the idea of telling people that, you know, the right says austerity, we say you deserve more, the right wants less democracy, we want you to have ownership and control over society. These are ideas that are, in the same way, viscerally compelling, and not only that, they stand up to not only moral and ethical tests, they stand up to the way society is actually structured, as opposed to these like false ideas on the right. So I actually think, if anything, the left should strive to be more accessible, and I think it's too much of a cop-out to just say the reason why they're able to succeed in these formats and we're not is because their ideas lend themselves to those formats. I don't actually think that's true. You know, one of the things we have with young writers with Jacobin is when they first come in, their first few submissions are laden with jargon and ideas that are like hard for ordinary people, for non-academics, for people who aren't Marxists, who aren't on the left to decipher. But within a year or two of engaging with Jacobin and engaging with other, you know, with these ideas even deeper. So in other words, by reading more Marx, by reading more theory, they actually develop the ability to write popularly, because to actually explain something simply, and everyone should be able to explain any radical idea to someone with, you know, an average high schooler, actually requires a thorough depth of knowledge, to not have to fall back on the crutch of being too insular and to using these specialist terms. So if anything, you know, I think that we, in the future, will be able to be just as accessible and to write weekly socialist listicles and whatnot that will get passed around and shared, and I don't think we should be afraid of that eventuality.
You know, you have that page in Norway also, yeah, at Facebook. It's those who are against immigrants getting free driver's licenses. It has 102,000 likes from different people, and it's full of pornographic contents. What you get there. When he spoke about BuzzFeedization, people might not know what that is, but BuzzFeed is an American webpage who spreads different articles and stuff very effectively through very extremely good emotional titles and lists with 10 points of different things, cat videos and those types of things that reach a lot of people. So BuzzFeedization is how to make contents that reaches a lot of people. And what he says is that the extreme right is at some can different places be good at doing this. And well, I'll answer that question in two ways. How to stop the far right? Generally, there was a Russian revolutionary called Trotsky, and he said that he had met 5 people in his life. The first one, he was a sexist, racist, anti-trade union, and so on. The second one was a progressive, anti-homophobic trade union guy who wanted to fight for a more progressive, better world. The 3 others were people in the middle, who sometimes were pulled towards the guy with the reactionary ideas, and other times pulled towards the guy with the more progressive and radical ideas. So the art for us being on the more progressive side is to try and to make better contents and to try and organize better and to try and isolate the idiot, the reactionary idiot, and try and pull those uncertain people towards us. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why we have those channels that we have, the net pages that we do have, to try and spread that type of contents that can give people more good sense content so that they become wiser and are better equipped to take good actions in the real life. But we've also organized towards, for instance, there was a Nazi page called fyre.no, and it was an anonymous Nazi page, and we said that it's a Nazi page. They tried and present themselves as an ordinary page, just revealing black guys doing rapes and so on all the time. So we established and found out who was behind that page, and we revealed it, and we had a dialogue with Dagbladet, one of the large newspapers in Norway, and we managed to make it a big story, and they had to close down. That was the end of the story. So we try and organize against those types of channels also. When it comes to the form, we try and copy BuzzFeed. So we try and make titles sometimes with a subject, with a verb, who plays on emotions. We try and be better at that because you don't need to have short titles like in the printed magazines and so on the net. You can have a longer title which says more and which gives people a better impression of what they're going to read. So we try and get better at doing that by presenting our more radical stuff and not the cat videos. So at the end I will just say that if anyone here, hvis noen vil bidra til Radikal Portal, så dere velkomne til det.
Thanks. Actually, we have one more question, and it has to be really, really short because we're way over time. So thanks.
Jeg skal snakke norsk, jeg snakker ikke engelsk, men veldig kort. Jeg tror at man må se erfaringer fra folk i Spania akkurat nå som kjemper ganske hardt for å komme seg ut i media. Og en god eksempel det som har skjedd med et ny politisk parti som heter Podemos. Den gruppe klart å bli i løpet av et år kanskje den største parti i Venstre, kanskje, det på vei dit. Og de har arbeidet med media veldig intens, og de faktisk gjennomført en veldig fin strategi. Og denne strategi går ut på å underlegge på en måte også alle medier til et politisk strategi. Så arbeider med informasjon veldig konsekvent for å få argumentasjonen fra folk mot en høyre ekstrem regjering. Og dette de klart fordi de veldig bevisst informasjon. De veldig godt utarbeidet informasjon, slik at media blir på en måte instrumentet for dette politiske arbeidet. På samme måte i Chile, studentene som kjempet, ja, veldig godt, kjempet å bygge sin eget nettverk for å få millioner mennesker på gata faktisk til å gå i streik imot regjeringen i flere tilfeller. Dette erfaringer noe som forteller dere noe, for jeg har ikke mer tid til å fortelle noe.
Thank you. I didn't really see a question there, so I think we end there. Thank you all for coming. It was nice talking with you, and thank you, Bhaskar and Vegard, for your presentations. It was really interesting.
November 2005, South American leaders voted against President Bush and said no to the free trade agreement of the Americas. An extensive agreement that was to cover all of the Americas from Canada in the north to Argentina and Chile in the south, with the exemption of Cuba. While presidents met, she organized a People's Summit that led 40,000 people to the streets. Thanks to her and the rest of the coordinating committee of the regional campaign against this agreement, they managed to stop what would be a monster NAFTA agreement. She was there when the debt movement of Latin America, Jubilee South, was established. Daily, she's at the offices in Buenos Aires, working at Dialogue 2000. Tonight, she's here with us, Beverly Keane. Good afternoon, Beverly. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. There are so many challenges in South America, and particularly also in Argentina, your country. Still, a great part of the population lives in poverty. Why do you use the time and energy in international agreements and politics like trade agreements?
That's sometimes a very good question. And we asked the 40,000 of us who were on the streets. Now can you hear me? Yeah. That's why you need 40,000 people in the streets, so they can hear you. I was starting to say that really, that's a question that we often ask ourselves, maybe like every morning when you get up and what has to be done today. But the fact of life is that, poverty is not a natural disaster. I mean, it's a disaster. And it's a disaster for millions and millions of people around the world. It's a disaster in human terms, it's a disaster in ecological terms, and it's also usually a disaster in political terms, if we look at how our political systems end up working. But it's not a natural disaster. And governments came together a few years back, for instance, in the Climate Change Convention, and decided that climate was not a natural disaster, and that people had to come together and governments had to come together and do something about it. And also decided, very importantly, that in doing something about it and in causing the problem of climate change, that there were differential responsibilities. Some countries had more responsibility, other countries had less responsibility in historic terms and present terms. And that's the same thing when we talk about poverty. And certainly if we look at poverty in Latin America, we have to say it's a huge disaster, but it's not a natural disaster. That means that there are decisions that are taken by leaders in our country, by politicians, by business people, by communities sometimes too. And there are also a lot of decisions that are taken outside of our country. The IMF for a long time took decisions that were the most important decisions facing poverty in Argentina. Today, it's not so much the IMF, but we have a lot of big banks and financial investors who take decisions every day that have an impact on people's lives in Argentina. So we feel that, if we want to really address the problems that people face in Argentina, the kinds of problems we face that have to do with poverty, it has to do with control over our resources, has to do with the possibility of exercising our own sovereignty as a people and making decisions about our future. Sometimes it even means, making mistakes. We all make mistakes, and we've made a lot of mistakes in those policy decisions. But we could say at least they're our mistakes, or at least we want to be able to make our own mistakes. We want to be able to learn from our own mistakes, and we want to be able to change the future. So that's why we see that these kinds of issues like, trade policy, the free trade agreement on the Americas, we said that was a major attempt by the US to recolonize all of Latin America. And thankfully, people throughout Latin America responded. And even more important, we were able to mobilize enough strength in Latin America to ensure that enough governments responded also and said, this is a mistake, we're not going to go that route. But we need to continue.
You also have other kind of free trade agreements, for example, Mercosur. What was so special about this free trade agreement of the Americas?
This was very special because, in a sense, you could say if we look at the 34 countries that were included in the negotiations for the free trade agreement, like you say, all of Latin America, the Caribbean, plus the United States and Canada, everyone except Cuba, which of course was excluded. It's a very mixed bag. We have a very big economy like the US, and we have some very small economies like Uruguay or Paraguay or Bolivia. We have countries like Brazil that has, a lot of its own multinationals, and we have countries that have lots of natural resources, like Argentina among them, and we have countries with an enormous amount of poverty, an enormous amount of transnational activity already in their countries. So there's lots of differences, but there's a huge difference in the relationships of power. And the US exercises historically huge power in all of Latin America. And we can see that not only in economic terms, but also in military terms. And we can see it in cultural terms. And we can see it particularly in commerce and finance. So it was important not to go into an agreement among very, very unequal partners. We say there's no way for us to come out of that in good terms. And it was also very important because the free trade area, the agreement of the Americas, in a sense, was an initial proposal, in a sense, that really wasn't just talking about trade, as most of us think about trade, I make some shoes and I want to sell them to you in Norway. So we're going to discuss the price and if there's a tariff. And no, we're talking about controlling investment. We're talking about education. We're talking about privatizing healthcare. So we're also talking about, not just trade, we're talking about everything. We're talking about control over our resources. We're talking about basic democracy. The negotiation, all what was being negotiating was never made public. It was never public. Not even our parliamentarians could know what was being actually discussed, what were the details. So anytime we had details, it was because somebody had been leaked. WikiLeaks were already active in the negotiations. But the documents themselves were never public. So we could never really know what was being discussed. And that means, obviously, we could never have any intelligent discussion. We could never decide on them politically. We could never say, yes, this is what we need, this is what we want, or no, it's not. So to enshrine and to give our future away, in a sense, to a bunch of secret negotiations, we say this is no way. And the other thing that was very, very important about this negotiation, and we'd already begun to see the impacts because it was present in the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that was signed in, it went into effect in January 1994, a date that more of us are familiar with because it was the date when the Zapatistas in southern Mexico rose up and said, this is it. We either stand up now or we're gone. And that was when the Zapatista uprising began, the same day, the very day that the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went in. And one of the things that was enshrined in that agreement was this notion of investor-state settlement of disputes, dispute settlement. So we're talking here about the loss of sovereignty, people's sovereignty, at two very fundamental levels. One is at the level of the nation state, saying we're not entering into any kind of agreement that's public, that we can know about, that we can debate and see whether it's good for us or not. But secondly, we said the very state itself, the nation state itself, is losing sovereignty in the face of the multinational corporation. And as we know, as we look around the world, as we look at Latin America, many, many multinational corporations are much more powerful than our nation states. So if we even just give away sovereignty as a nation state, then who's going to defend us? And how are we going to defend our rights? We're saying we are left very much alone and very vulnerable.
But you managed to stop it.
We managed.
How did you manage?
Well, it certainly wasn't me alone, that's for sure. The campaign, I think, was a 4-year, very concentrated campaign in Latin America. And the most important thing, perhaps, to stop a lot of the discussions that we often have, we're very good about nitpicking, you know, we have to discuss the details. And so early on, as we were beginning to analyze this, and with a lot of help from our colleagues in Mexico, who were already living the impacts of NAFTA, and they're saying, you know, no, there's no point in talking about trying to make this better. Because the more you talk about it, the worse it's going to get. Just believe it. And so the basic of the campaign, as we came together around Latin America, was no to the FTAA. Just no. We're not interested. We don't want it. We're not going to talk about democratic safeguards and the possibility of, no, because it doesn't happen. In real life, that's just a fairy tale. We know this. And so that was very important, about setting, in a sense, a clear basis, a clear set of criteria for organizing the campaign. And we built a structure that brought together, in a sense, the major social networks throughout Latin America, the trade unions, the peasants' organizations, the Women's March, Jubilee South, there's a debt movement, many other groups that were academics, the universities, students, all kinds of networks in the country. And also we said, but the most important thing that's going to happen in the campaign is what happens in each country. We can't just do it behind doors, also talking to our governments in the foreign ministries or whatever. We need to have mobilization. We need to be moving on the streets. And that means we need to have strong networks in each country that are educating, that are taking the debate to town halls and to the unions and to the schools. And we need to move people. So we set up a coordinating committee, and we decided that the tool that we were going to focus on was holding a popular referendum. We said people need to speak out. And the best way we can organize that speaking out is to vote. So we're going to have a popular referendum. So we organized a popular consultation, tried to organize one at least in every country throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. We agreed on one question. We spent an entire weekend, 6 months of consultation, another weekend meeting to decide what the question would be. Very interesting to see whether the proper answer was yes or no. I could go into that, but that'd be a long discussion. Anyway, but we agreed on the question, said, okay, so everybody's going to organize these consultations, these referendums in your own country. Each of you knows, you know, what's appropriate, who needs to be there, how you can do it, and it was different in every country. But we all had one question, and then we added things as were appropriate to each setting. And that was very important for making us work, for making us get out and take the message. We often said in Argentina that it was an easy campaign. It was too easy, because we sort of felt sometimes it was enough, you know, you had your spiel, but we started out by saying, well, the free trade agreement in the Americas is a proposal from the US, and they said, that's enough, we're against it. We tried to take the debate a little bit further so we could really understand why, in addition, we were against it. But that was important, to have that popular consultation.
So the result was a no.
Yep, it definitely was a no.
He has been an important person in the campaign against the European Partnership Agreements. Thanks to him, investment, or the EU had to withdraw investment and services from the negotiations of trade agreements with the former colonies. He is a trade policy officer at the Belgian NGO coalition 11-11-11 and a co-person in the Seattle to Brussels network. Please welcome Mark Mice. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Last time we met, we were lost in the gardens of WTO in Geneva, and we were actually climbing a wall to get into our meeting. And then the time before that, we were eating a lot of meat and drinking a lot of beer in Nairobi, together with lots of people from East Africa and discussing EPAs. So for me, it seems like you're all over. Wherever and whenever there is a campaign about trade, you are there. Why are you traveling the whole world and climbing walls for trade politics?
Well, it's trade politics is happening all over the world to begin with, and I'm the trade policy officer of our organization, and we are tracking European trade policy for many, many years, and the European Union is just the most active player in the world when it comes to trade agreements. They have always professed that they are in favor of multilateralism, but they have always been the world champion in negotiating free trade agreements and bilateral agreements. But in their rhetoric, they embrace multilateralism. And so, yeah, they are negotiating with almost the whole world at the same time. If you take the negotiations between the European Union and the so-called ACP countries, Africa, the Caribbean and Pacific, that's 75 countries. And they're negotiating with the 10 countries from ASEAN. They have negotiated with Central America. They're negotiating with Mercosur. Have negotiated with Chile, and they have negotiated with the Andes countries. They're negotiating with the Gulf states. They're negotiating now also with Japan. They have negotiated with Canada, and they almost covered the whole world. And so wherever they go, we follow them.
The first time I took part of the international movement for trade justice, coordinated by our World is Not for Sale network, I was astonished by the multitude and the effectiveness of the network. I remember there were all kinds of organizations, grassroots, international NGOs from all over the world. And at one meeting, we were actually counting all the mother tongues present in the room, and we counted 23. So I was very amazed about this network. Who are they? Who are these people and organizations?
Well,
and how are they working?
The network was actually born out of the resistance against the new negotiating round in the World Trade Organization. When the European Union, just 3-4 years after the creation of the World Trade Organization, came with the idea to have yet another new broad round of negotiations, there was an outcry through the whole world, because the European Union had, together with the United States, been pushing for this large round of negotiations from 1986 to 1994, the Uruguay round. Out of that came the creation of the World Trade Organization, and one of the arguments that they used to convince the developing countries to accept a World Trade Organization was that once you had this standing organization, the World Trade Organization, you no longer needed these exhausting negotiating rounds that would carry on for years. You would have a standing body in which everybody would have a say and so on, and no new rounds were necessary. And it's only 3 years after the WTO was created that the European Commission came with the idea, we need a new round. And there was a huge outcry. I remember that at the end of the 90s, just before Seattle, there was a civil society statement signed by 1,700 organizations, and this was in pre-internet times, actually. So that was a huge success, and they all moved to Seattle. We had the battle in Seattle. After that, we followed the WTO to Doha, where the Doha round was launched. And in the meantime, there was this phenomenon called the World Social Forum. And it's at the World Social Forum that we consolidated actually our working together. So at such a World Social Forum, that's what you do there. You come together and you foster good ties and you organize so that you can follow these issues like the World Trade Organization. So out of that came the coalition, Our World is Not for Sale. And the name that we chose for that was because in trade negotiations, actually, the negotiators, they make everything that we cherish and value, they turn that into a commodity that they can, like was said just before, in trade negotiations, you can also negotiate about health, about culture, and so on. And so we said, our world is not for sale. We cannot sell everything. We refuse to accept that these things would be commodities and that you, trade negotiators, would be the ones deciding on how these things would be done. That was the coalition, and it's a very rich coalition. There are trade unions in there, there are farmers' organizations in there, there are fisher folks in there, the NGOs are there from all over the world. And an interesting thing about World is Not for Sale organization is that at World Trade Organization ministerial meetings, we act in a very coordinated way, and we can do things like, wow, we see that there is pressure on this and this country. Can you and you and you go and talk to these and these and these ones because you're from there, and then so you can divide tasks, you can collect information, you can act collectively, and it's a very strong force at ministerial meetings, among others.
She took Norway by storm as the president of the youth organization of the Labour Party, AUF. She was a vital person in the movement against European membership here in Norway. And if I might say it, she's also a progressive voice inside of the greatest political party in Norway, AP. Today she's the head of the Committee of Foreign Affairs at the Parliament. Please welcome Anniken Huitfeldt. Good afternoon, Anniken.
Good afternoon.
Thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon in these very hasty times. It's quite some time since your engagement with the EU debate now, but could you tell us shortly why were you so engaged in the membership debate?
That was 25 years ago, and when I became the chairperson of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense, Jonas Gahr Støre, the last Minister of Foreign Affairs in Norway, he said, "You are the first one anti-European as the head of this committee." So it has never been an anti-European Union membership chairperson in this committee before. So it is a change, I think. I'm proud of what I was a part of, because I did believe, and I still believe, in a country's right to have our own political development, economic development. And if you look upon the different European countries these days, with the wave of unemployment, I think there is a result of the economic policy in the European Union. And what was also a very important argument for me was also the right to have an own foreign policy. I think that Norway is a very small country. We don't have, much influence in very many international organizations, but we do have an influence as a small partner outside the European Union. So I think that's strengthening our voice in the international arena, the fact that we're not a part of the European Union.
How does that affect us discussing this transatlantic negotiations going on between EU and US, do you think, being outside of the EU?
Well, we could have more influence if we had been a part of the European Union. But what I found out when I read this resolution from the Social Democratic Party in Germany, they adopted a resolution in 5 pages. It's a very radical resolution. But what I found was some of the same argument we used in Norway back in 1994. National sovereignty, the parliament should be in power, and so on and so on. So it's in fact the same argument they're using now in Germany against this agreement.
Some of the same arguments are also being used regarding other negotiations going on now. For example, the trade of services negotiations, TISA. Do you understand these preoccupations?
Yeah, I think it's important because I'm a favor of trade. I think it's important for developing countries to get access to the European market, to the American market. But it's a matter of how should this treaties be, what kind of regulation is it? So I think we should have more focus on it. I think it's very important, this conference, that you get much more focus and debate on the different parts of this treaties. And been watching what they did on the European trade unions and their cooperation with the American trade unions, and they have been adopting a lot of resolutions on this, how this mechanism, what kind of regulation that should be, that they should be a part of.
Beverly was talking about the problems and challenges of the lack of information and lack of transparency. These negotiations are totally secret, more or less, until they are signed and then passed over to the parliament. What will you do as head of the Committee of Foreign Affairs at the parliament to ensure more information, more debates on such negotiations?
Well, we're trying to get more information out of the government, but it's very difficult, and it's also difficult for the Norwegian government to get information, I think, because we got reports from Washington, we also get reports from other European capitals, but we don't get enough information. And that's also the main arguments from very many social democratic organizations all over Europe. They want more transparency. So I will do what I can do, but the Norwegian government also have this problem that they don't get enough information.
And regarding negotiations that Norway is part of, could we influence the information and discussion on negotiations we are part of?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And we had a meeting last week, and you actually influenced us on putting an interpellation in the Norwegian Parliament, and we'll do that in some weeks, because I think it's important that we also put pressure on the Norwegian government to get more information about what kind of agreement they are negotiating on.
He has been abroad for quite some years, working at the offices of the Public Services International, the trade union federation based in Geneva. Now he's back at the Trade Union of Public Service Workers here in Norway, in Oslo, Fagforbundet, the greatest trade union of Norway with 340,000 members. Please welcome Rolf Rønning-Hansen. You spent last weekend in Geneva, I think, with hundreds, I guess, of trade unionists from the entire world in a conference on the ongoing negotiations of the TISA, the Trade in Services Agreement. Why do Norwegian trade unions engage and bother about trade agreements? Isn't this merely an issue for the Norwegian export business?
Well, for a trade union, our basic principle is solidarity, and we would support fair trade, but not free trade that actually break down democracy, make it very difficult for people to make their voice heard, and so on. And I think TISA is one of the worst inventions that ever have come up to break down democracy. One thing is that the only information we get is from leaks, like WikiLeaks and so on, saying that the real text they are negotiating will be secret up till it's signed, and then 5 years more. How can you live with after a secret text? That's crazy. I hope it's wrong. But we don't get any information from the government. We have these leaks to listen to. And when we are looking at this agreement, we think it goes much further than, for instance, the EEA negotiations. It will change Norway completely if it's accepted, introduced here. We have, for instance, this ratchet and still stand clause, and I think about being with a ratchet, being a social democratic minister now. What would you do? We have 3 years left with the ultra blue government, and the ratchet and the still stand clause means that, especially the ratchet, it goes only one way. If you are opening more markets, more parts of service for liberalization, there's no way back. That's the problem. And then you can do a rally, election campaign. We want to take back this and this service, which they actually are doing, some social democratic parties, other parties. But it's impossible. So this is really undemocratic, and it undermines the whole system of Norway. And why should you then become a politician? You can't change anything. So this next 3 years, if the right-wing government now manage to sign this and we get a ratchet clause, well, then they just move on with their majority in parliament and do everything to cut down on workers' rights, destroy the laws we have to protect workers and consumers, and there's no way back, because this is an agreement on services only. And for us, which handle only services, this is really serious, because it's about democracy, it's about our welfare state. How can we then actually regain what we do? How can we correct the bad things that the right-wing government do? How can we take things back to the municipalities, etc., etc.? And TISA is negotiated outside WTO, because WTO, incredibly enough, it was too democratic. It was too many countries that had a say and could stop negotiations, stop the really bad things from coming. So now they are taking it from outside, and then they want to introduce it back to WTO members that, as a fait accompli. They have to sign up on it. So this is why we as a trade union really have a responsibility to react and try to mobilize against this TISA agreement.
Yes, this is quite an undemocratic side of the services negotiations going on. That it's still just a group negotiating it, but when it's signed up, it's supposed to cover all the WTO members. That is more or less all countries in the world. Is this been discussed, and how do you feel about it in a southern country like Argentina, Beverly?
Well, it's very hard to discuss it, because as we said, the first thing we don't have is really information about what's being discussed. We have some leaks. We have some WikiLeaks, and what they tell us is that it's much worse than the FTAA, for instance, and much worse even than the WTO agreements that we have already tried to contest at many points. And one of the ways that we see that it's much worse, for instance, is that it brings straight into the trade negotiations all of the question of financial services, for instance. And that means, everything from what banks do to the ways countries get into debt, and how we as peoples can get out of debt. And this comes into trade negotiations. And for a country and people like Argentina, who faces a very serious debt problem, and we have been working for the better part of the last 30 years to try and convince our government to investigate, for instance, the debt, and to be able to understand and to be able to really see why and how the debt is illegitimate, and why we shouldn't be paying it as Argentine people. If the negotiations that are ongoing in TISA are actually concluded, even if Argentina doesn't participate, and it's not now participating, that will have an impact. It will make it much harder to try and craft, in a sense, spaces for freedom. If we're here to talk about freedom this weekend, what we're talking about is really having the possibility of national sovereignty, of people's sovereignty, really having an impact on policy. And here what we're saying is we'll take all of the question of finances, all of the questions of investment, all of the questions of banking and debt, and make it impossible for a government to do the only sensible thing to do from the perspective of fulfilling human rights and nature rights, which is often to stop paying, investigate, see what's really legitimate, how many times have we already paid it back, and then try and negotiate better terms if that's what it's all about, better terms of payment. All of that would be impossible if the TISA comes into being, because that impacts each of the banks, it impacts each of the financial institutions, and you get kind of, how would you say, you get surrounded so that you really have no way out unless you accept the same terms. And that's the way our countries operate. Well, we have to get in the negotiations, because if we don't, then maybe, we won't have any say at all. So we really are very concerned in terms of the trade negotiations right now. In Argentina, we are a little more focused on the trade, the possibility of the negotiations with the European Union and the Mercosur. And we're also putting a lot of energy right now on trying to prevent the free trade agreement that was signed between the Mercosur and Israel from continuing. So we are focusing some energy now on stopping that agreement, because we see it makes a sham of any kinds of human rights clauses or democracy clauses in these trade negotiations. We see very clearly that it's just not doing that. It works the other way.
So there are several negotiations going on, bilaterally, regionally, plurilaterally, and I don't know what. There are EPAs and there are EFTA have some agreements here and there. Norway is one of the countries taking initiative for more of these plurilateral, that is like group-wise negotiations. And I remember when I was part of the Norwegian delegation to the WTO in 2011, quite many of the ministers from developing countries, they underscored that those kind of negotiation was precisely what will not make a good climate to go on in the WTO. Mark, is it so? Why is it better to go on with WTO?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. The only thing that you have in the WTO is at least developing countries can stand together. And it's because of that nothing is moving in the WTO. And as was predicted, actually, if the WTO does not serve anymore the interests of the big countries and the big companies, they take their business elsewhere. In the WTO also, every member state has one vote, but they never voted because they always seek consensus. And seeking consensus actually means that nothing can be done by all the developing countries against the rich countries. And people have asked me yet many years before, why do not all the developing countries together take a vote? Because together they are 2/3 majority of the World Trade Organization. The answer is, if they do that, the others walk out. And that's what they're doing now. They're walking with their feet, they take their business and negotiations elsewhere. So there is what is on the table in the WTO is also not what we would want and what the developing countries want, but they managed to stop it there. What I think is important that we see is we can run after, like chicken, after each of these free trade agreements. And we have been doing that in the European Union for a while. We tried to follow the negotiations with Ecuador, Peru, or whatever. But why do we actually accept that trade policy is made the way that it's done? Secret mandates, secret negotiations, and parliaments that we can only say yes or no in the end. Why do we accept that? This is something that belongs to, what is it, 18th century? This is ancien regime. We had a French Revolution in the meantime and other revolutions also. Why don't we incorporate trade policy into the democracy and we say there is no way that the executive, the government, can negotiate away our rights and leave us no other option than to vote against and favor it at the end. We want to see the text, and that's what we also say everywhere in the world. We should no longer accept that trade negotiators say, because of the effectivity of the negotiations, it has to be secret. The hell with the effectivity of the negotiations. Democracy is much more important. And we actually, as an organization that has been working on trade policy for so many years, we have been working on the trade negotiations between the European Union and developing countries. And we actually never had much support for that in Europe because it was with the European, developing countries. It doesn't concern us. It actually brings jobs home to Europe. Now that we are negotiating with the United States, people realize, wow, this is different. We can impose ourselves on developing countries, but we cannot impose ourselves on the United States, and they will make us change our regulation and so on, and they will make us bleed. So now we see that many interest groups are working on trade again. The consumers, the environmental organizations, the health organizations, the trade unions, and we all together, we have a huge coalition now in Europe going on. And we should take that opportunity not just to stop TTIP and to stop the invested state dispute settlement. We should take that opportunity to change the rules, to say never again do we want you to use trade negotiations as a tool to change the status quo at home, to change our rules and regulations. We should no longer accept that. And that means not only just to say stop to TTIP, but stop to this undemocratic way of doing things. That methodology of using trade negotiations to change the legislative and regulatory environment, we should stop from doing that. And what we require from there is what we had in several other negotiations. The negotiating texts have to be published. So I'm fine that negotiators negotiate. But once that they have reached what they want to negotiate, it should be published for all to see and then for all parliaments to vote upon. And if we cannot do that, we should say, no, we don't want it. Not now, not never. No more of that.
If I can just add there. It's good. Good campaign support. This notion that is in what we've seen of the TISA text, it not only says that the negotiating texts are secret until they're signed, but they're secret after they're signed, and they're secret even if they're not signed. So we can never even know, supposedly, until 4 or 5 years down the line, what it was they were talking about, because that might affect, it's ridiculous. It's bad. But I think it's, if we think about these, taking their business elsewhere, which is clearly what's going on now in the negotiations, the big transnationals and the governments that serve them are taking their business elsewhere. But they've already left in place some really critical bad news agents. And one of them, just to, again, reinforce these investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. The WTO, its big innovation in trade, in a sense, was to set up this court that has kind of almost, we could call them secret panels of so-called judges that rule on the WTO rules and decide who breaks them and who doesn't. And this is also something that we should be very concerned about as citizens, because the possibility of appeal, possibility of justice, the possibility of our seeking justice in the face of unjust consequences from these trade agreements is left to a bunch of bureaucrats in Geneva. And we don't even have access to them. So we have lots of problems in Argentina. I don't know about it here. We have lots of problems getting our judges to be just. But at least we can fight with them face to face. If we have to fight with a bunch of bureaucrats in Geneva whom we don't even know who they are, and we don't know how they're selected, and we don't know what the criteria are, and we do know what the rules are, but we don't know how they interpret them, then the possibility of justice is outrageous. And we're seeing this right now in Argentina. Again, going back to our debt problem, and you may have heard about these vulture funds that are flying all over Argentina. And what are we talking about? We're talking about a New York judge who is apparently deciding what we should be paying in Argentina. And our government's not even listening to what our judicial system in Argentina is saying. It's saying that the New York judge is more important. And that's what's being reinforced over and over again in these trading rules too. And so that's part of what we have to stop and say, no, this is not it. This is not where we want to be going. It's not going to help us. It's not for our human rights. It's not for the rights of the environment. It's not sovereign.
Here in Norway, just like in Europe and in US and all over, I guess, the engagement and the mobilization around trade agreements and investment agreement is rising. And just this very last year, actually, several organizations, several trade unions have been waking up, I would say, after sleeping quite some while. And we will have a look at the list and the various organizations and trade unions that have been coming with declaration against TTIP, against TISA, and investor-state tribunals that you were talking about now, and so on and so forth. We will have a quick look at it. Yeah, thank you. Last week, the Trade Union of Industrial and Petroleum Workers, Industri og Energi, declared at their General Assembly a quite clear and quite strong declaration against agreements reducing the ability of political space in general, and more specifically towards the TTIP negotiations. Also, yeah. Could you put on lysbildefremvisning so that it's actually, like Mette should not be there all the time. They should get there, all of them. That's unfair. Just some days later, LO in Oslo, the Confederation, locally here in the capital, also made a declaration against TTIP. On the International Action Day of TISA, the 11th of October, the following trade unions declared that Norway should withdraw from the TISA negotiations. Fagforbundet, that is the public workers, public services workers, Fellesorganisasjonen, Norsk Transportarbeiderforbund, NTL Sentralforvaltningen. And she gets all the credit now. Further on, another confederation called Unio has reclaimed greater transparency of the TISA negotiations. Also, Utdanningsforbundet, that is the workers of the educational sector, has declared that they are against all agreements, including investor-state dispute mechanism. Next week, NTL, Norsk Tjenestemannslag, will discuss whether to drop negotiations on TISA or not in the General Assembly. Nei til EU, the No to the EU membership movement, has declared that Norway should pull out from the TISA negotiation and that we should not implement any TTIP through the EØS, the partnership with the EU. Not to mention all the solidarity organizations that engaged in the public hearing at the parliament in May and asked and begged the parliament not to ratify the free trade agreement with Colombia. Let me mention some of them: Latinamerika-gruppene, Norsk Folkehjelp, Fokus, and Attack. That's just some examples, but my point is there has been quite a movement in the trade union movement in Norway and in between organizations this very last month. And that's very nice. But Rolf, I would like to ask you, looking at the mobilization going on now in the trade union movement in Norway, one could think that Norway didn't negotiate free trade agreements the last 10 years. But we have been negotiating quite many agreements, especially specific with a lot of development countries. Where is the solidarity feeling in the Norwegian trade union movement? Why didn't we engage during those 10 years? Do we need to feel the consequences on our own body before we make a statement?
Now, of course, it's much easier to react if you really can see the consequences clearly for your membership. And that's what have happened, at least with Fagforbundet, but we have always had the position that we wanted fair trade, but I don't think we have been really into the politics about trade negotiations, but we have participated in a movement against the MAI and GATS, so we are into it, but not as much as we will engage now, I think. And especially this because they now try to change the whole system with the public services and all services. Earlier, you could have a fight on what to liberalize. You had a positive list. The government said that this should be liberalized, this and this. Now you have to list everything that shall not be liberalized. And what if you forget something? Then it's lost. So the situation is much more serious now for the trade unions and for the Norwegian population. And luckily enough, Norway was one of the first countries that put up their offers, so to say, for TISA, a list of 35 pages with numbers that most people can't understand. And they say they will try to avoid exposing public services. But then they completely forget what public services are. I just had to write down what they say, because they say if you exclude public services, that's okay, but they are following the GATS regulation, Article 1.3, where they say services provided on commercial basic, nor in competition with one or more suppliers will be considered as public services. And in Norway, we have had competitive tendering in most areas. So we have a few privateers in public services, or we have a lot of them. So actually, it's about everything except the military and the police, I think, and maybe the state administration. So we really start to see how serious it is now, and how wide is this. It's about everything that we have been working on to protect the welfare state and to build the welfare state. And no, it will not be possible to continue with new things. When I was in Switzerland to discuss with other trade unions, we had a funny problem. One of the Swiss unions, they told about a development going on in the University of Lausanne, where they tried to develop new forms of energy. And the Swiss government wanted to regulate that, just like they had done with petroleum and oil. But that might be impossible if you sign a TISA agreement. Then they can't put these strong regulations up. Because what we are seeing now is a regulation of the right to regulate. In fact, this is a freedom. You talk about freedom. It's a freedom for the big companies to exploit public services. One of you talked about being treated as a colony. Well, the world is divided now, so you can't go with the old-fashioned ways to take a colony, but public services is just like the new colonies, where they can invest, take a lot of money out. So I think maybe we haven't done enough, even though I think we have done a lot on trade earlier, the investment agreement and so on. We have followed the WTO, but at least now we have decided that it's now or never. We have to really try to stop this, and especially when we are in this situation with the ultra-right government. We have to do it, otherwise we will be very bad out.
Mark, here in Norway, one of the main arguments for joining TTIP and for signing the TISA is a solidarity argument, actually, that we need to help you in the EU as you are in a crisis and there is a very high unemployment rate, and these agreements will create so many jobs. So shouldn't Norway then engage in these agreements to save you in EU?
That would be fantastic. Then we would be with 29 countries and national governments opposing the European Commission and the plans of the corporate Europe. Well, in any case, the whole promise of TTIP bringing jobs, it is a plain lie. There have been a number of assessments based on the general equilibrium models that predict that there will be so much growth of income, of GDP, of jobs. All these studies have been examined by other scholars, and they have found many, many flaws in them. The latest study is one by the Tufts University, which have used a completely different approach, and they find that TTIP for Europe will bring us less growth, less income, less jobs. We will lose about 600,000 jobs. There will also be loss of jobs on the American side. What TTIP actually is doing, it's creating a lot of transatlantic trade that will replace a lot of intern European trade. And it will also shift the economy in such a way that there's more profit made by the large companies, which now will be able to work on a larger scale. So what actually happens with TTIP is that the share of labor in the global, in the general, how do you say that, in the gross domestic product, the share of labor will go down, the share of capital will go up. So if you look at what TTIP actually does, it is increasing trade, it's increasing opportunities for big companies, but it's not increasing opportunities for workers and families. And that is what it is doing. So it's actually a very dangerous agreement, bringing less wealth to Europe than what they say. And one other thing is that it's very important for Europe, and that perhaps is not seen that much, is that one of the main reasons that Europe wants to negotiate with the United States is they have a lot of national resources, which we in Europe do not have. They have petrol, they have shale gas and all these things. That's what we want to have. And we are willing in Europe to pay a large price for that. At least the companies are willing to do that. But we don't see any benefits coming out of that. And then we haven't talked about the regulatory convergence that they are seeking. What the European Union is trying to get into the agreement is convergence between the rules and regulations between the European Union and the United States. And there are many ways in which they can do that. And this is also very new to many of us. What you normally expect is that in such an agreement, you will come to new rules and regulations that you will then live up to. But the European Union, in the past 10 years, has changed its trade negotiations and trade agreements in such a way that they have all become live agreements. So it creates, through trade agreements, new joint bodies, like a joint council, a joint trade committee, and these trade committees can then later set new rules. And this is also what will happen with the United States. We will create a council and joint committees and so forth. So we might come to joint new rules for some issues. For other issues, we will create a committee that will then in the future set new rules. For other things, we will set principles, guiding principles that will guide new rules. And one of the most important guiding principles in all the trade agreements is the least trade distorting. All the rules and regulations have to be the least trade distorting. They do not have to be the least environmental distorting, and they don't have to be the most socially friendly. They have to be the least trade distorting. And using that yardstick in the future, you can say you want to now regulate your nuclear plants, or you want to regulate this and that. It has to be the least trade distorting. And who's going to judge what least trade distorting is? It's not us, it's some kind of panel somewhere that will then judge whether this or that policy was the least trade distorting or not. Or even also with TISA, whether it was necessary. So you have to prove as a government, if you want to make an environmental rule or social rule, that that rule was necessary to achieve the purpose. And if they find there was an alternative that was least trade distorting, then that should get preference. If you build that into such kind of agreements, then you have actually set the parameters for future things. And that makes such agreements actually rather a transatlantic constitution. It will more regulate the regulators than it will regulate trade. And this is something that we have to be very careful about. So we do not expect any benefits from this agreement, not with regard to our economy, but also not with regard to our future regulation. And I think that many people in Europe are aware that this is going on. There's another way in which they will regulate. It is mutual recognition. If they say if a car is safe in the United States, then we accept that that car, when it comes to Europe, is also safe. So we accept each other's level of protection or level of security. But if you do that, of course, and if you then allow this to be traded freely, what will happen is that the less safe rule will in the end drive out the safer rule because it's cheaper. And so mutual recognition will lead actually to a race to the bottom. So there's so many reasons looking at this agreement that we need to be very worried, and we should not accept it.
Beverly, the South American leaders and state, they didn't only say no to the free trade agreement of the ALCA, they also managed to develop an alternative model of international trade agreements, ALBA. Would you please, and moreover, maybe you now think that these South American leaders that were the ones opposing the American agreement was Evo Morales, Correa in Ecuador, and so on. It was not actually. It was the Mercosur countries. It was Brazilian president. It was the Argentinian president, Paraguayan, and so on. But could you please shortly give us some insight into what that alternative model looks like?
ALBA. Maybe before doing that, I've just been thinking about the Zapatistas, because when they said no, there's nothing good that's going to come here. What they also said is that, we need to be doing what we recognize to be good for our people. And so they've been about the business, to say it in one way, since 1994, of strengthening their own communities. And this has very real results in people's lives in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of protecting farmers and food sources, food sovereignty. It has a lot to do with building their own judicial system so that problems in the community are dealt with in the community. I don't want to suggest that the Zapatista communities don't have problems, because they do. There's a lot of repression, and there's a lot of attempts to destroy those communities. But what we can clearly say is that, like, if ALBA, it's not just a question of saying, no, we don't want to go that way. What can we do? What do we recognize as good for us? And the basis of the ALBA agreement, which is fundamentally an agreement between Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Dominican, a few countries from the Caribbean, has to do with the notion of complementarity. It's can we find those things that you do better than we do, and so we can have a basis there for sharing. Not so much for trading, but for sharing. Fundamental to the ALBA agreements is sharing in health services. But it's a long ways from the notion of TISA, which is that you let private companies come in and tell you how to run your hospital. We're talking about sharing medical personnel, recognizing, in a sense, degrees and possibilities, and coming together in agreements of complementarity. So really finding ways in which we can build and strengthen the world in which we want to live through these kinds of sharing agreements. And ALBA has made some real progress. It also faces very real challenges. And there's a big discussion in Latin America today about how to further that model. And not all the governments in South America would like to go the same way. Some of our governments are very convinced, unfortunately, that we need more of these international trading agreements. That's the pressure that we are facing even in South America to negotiate this trade agreement between the Mercosur and the European Union. But it's important, I think, that people's movements and social organizations, trade unions, Via Campesina, the farmers, the Women's March, Jubilee South, all kinds of networks throughout the region are again coming to say that we have to come together as we did in the early part of this century and really say, as Mark was suggesting, no, this is not the way we want to negotiate. And indeed, we don't have the strength to follow each and every one of the negotiations, but we know that what's happening in those details is just worse and worse and worse. So it's time to stop and say, really, we've got to put an end to this madness. We need to strengthen our own capacity as movements to be able to ensure that our own governments and our own countries are responding to our demands and our rights.
Based in your experience actually stopping the monster agreement in Americas, if you should give one recommendation to all these people now in the end on what to do, how to go further, and how to mobilize here in Norway, what would that one recommendation be?
Well, I certainly don't know how you mobilize in Norway, but the one recommendation would be is we've got to move people, and we've got to put those people in the streets. People have to make your voices heard. And certainly, if you can come together, maybe not with Norway coming together with the European Union to join in the negotiations, but certainly if people in Norway and your organizations coming together with organizations in Europe and in South America and around the world to say no to continuing the madness of these kinds of negotiations, of really handing over our future to a bunch of unknown bureaucrats. We take that message to the streets everywhere in the world. We've really got some power going. And I think that's the kind of power that it's going to take to really put an end to this madness. So do it.
Can I add something there? Just one very short one. I think in the mobilization against TTIP, we have to be a little bit more firm and serious than we have so far been. It's good to demonstrate, but I think we should take the example of Seattle and block. And we know when the Americans come to Europe to negotiate, we don't know where exactly they will be, but if we will be there early in the morning, which is already a big effort, then we know where they will be negotiating. And so we will also have to block intersections and so on and disturb the negotiations and see that we actually are sick and tired of these things. That's what we have to do in Europe. And that's what we are willing to prepare for in the next negotiating rounds.
Are you joining that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're finished off. That's the last word to the guest, always.
Flowers, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Hjertelig.
Wow. These are Norwegian flowers, or they come from Colombia?
Just to let you know that the session is actually not over. There's another 45 minutes starting straight on now with a cultural contribution and Amy Goodman. Just so you know.
يا هلا أهلا وسهلا we say more than welcome it means. I want to tell you a little story. Is it possible? So hundreds and hundreds of years ago, a little Palestinian village between the mountains of the Galilee, farmers, land workers, living off the land, planting and harvesting and feeding their children from Mother Earth. One of the years it didn't rain and the earth got really dry and the plants die and the kids are hungry. So the people of the village thought to themselves what they can do. Let's go up to the man, the rich man of the castle. He will probably help us. They went, took themselves and went to the up the mountain where the castle is, where sits the rich man. They entered the castle and asked the mercy of the rich man. The rich man, you want me to help you? Poor peasants, go away, out of my palace. The peasants, hungrier than ever, frustrated than ever, went back to their kids with empty hands. The young kids, the young ones, the youths didn't shut up about it. They collected themselves and waited in the bushes, waited in the woods. Up on the trees they climbed and waited for the rich man from the castle to go for the day of hunting. And it happened. The rich man from the castle riding his horse, going down into the woods to go hunting. Then the ambush happens. وقف! ارفع ايديك! ارفع ايديك! No, please don't kill me, please. I'm rich, I can give you what. قول لك وقف ارفع ايديك قول لا get your hands up I'll kill you, I'll shoot you. Please. And they tied him up and threw him aside the river. The young guys went to the village and started calling everybody. Hello, cousins, brothers, hello, children, everybody, yalla, let's go up, let's go into the castle. And everybody did it. Everybody went up to the castle and cleaned up everything. Went back with food, went back with wheat, went back with something to feed. And the children of the village got their smile back, and the parents, by seeing their little children smiling, got their own smile back. On the other hand, the rich man of the castle went back to his castle and looked at the castle from inside and found nothing and started crying and saying, oh ya halali ya mali, oh my fortune, oh my money, oh ya halali ya mali, ya halali ya mali, oh my fortune, oh my money. And from that day on, in Palestine, this is what we call halali ya mali, halali ya mali. Everybody gonna say ya halali ya mali. Help us here, please, with your hands. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. Say with us please. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. Let's hear you say. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. أيوة. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. أيوة. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي.
شوف صلنا فوق ال60 سنة ولسه بنعد، بسمع كلام سلام بشوف ايدين بتمد، بطلت حاس حالي انسان، مصاري مصالح هو ادمان بدمر كل الامل والاحلام. الشعب كان حلمه بس ينام، كان حلمه يعيش حياة فيها امان، حلم ضاع من زمان، مقطوع الكهرباء مقطوع المي، انفجار اطار اللزاز، بحتاج مساعدة نفسيتي اتدمرت والبلد اللي جنبي اتعمرت. بسمعهم بيحكوا عن سلام بس مش شايف غير ناس عايشين في بنتوستان، سجن كتير كبير وملان. ايوه هيك شوف سجن كتير كبير وملان. حل ما في حل، فيني روح محل اتخبى شوي بس لامتى، بحس انا دايما نفس الموضوع، الف باتا ممنوع دموع لا للركوع. لمين عم بحكي لإلك او للي ما بفهم لغتي، عم بحكي مع اثنين بس في هذه اللحظة بحكي مع اللي بفهم مشاكلي وعقدي. شو بتعمل لما ما بدهم سلام معك؟ بتطنش لامتى الارض ما ضلش؟ حاول عيش حياة عادية وانسى شي اسمه القضية الفلسطينية، ما بتحس في الذنب لما مش شايف حقوق بس شايف دم. كل منيح وتغزى شكلك ناسي شو اللي عم بصير في غزة، ليه بدنا نعيد والنادي واضح انه الدنيا مش سائلة في بلادي، كل ما دافع عن نفسي برجعوا بسموني ارهابي. هاي مش اول لو اخر مرة بتسمعني بحكي هيك، فعود دنيك تسمع ناس بتطالب حرية، ناس مش حتسكت عبم الجدار يسقط يسقط، ناس مش حتسكت عبم الجدار يسقط يسقط يسقط.
يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي. يا حلالي يا مالي يابا everybody gonna say. يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي يا مالي
يا حلالي يا مالي يا حلالي. The truth shall not mold us no more. These walls shall not hold us no more. Their schemes can't control us no more. our rebel rhymes we are drop. Say rebel rhymes we are drop. And the music not stop. Cause we are come back again and we be stronger than them. We lasting longer than them. Say through the beatings, the lashes, the violence and clashes, like a phoenix from the ashes we arise. Time for the youth to get wise and come realize that the next generation will be ruling the nation, enough with corruption and lies. Cause when the people learn as the tables turn, say move one and I'll make the leaders fall, as the rebellious rams will expose their crimes. Salt al-Mukawami will set the people free.
A very big thank you to the cultural contribution, singer Hanuna, the rapper Stormtrap, the singer and storyteller Valaspite, and then the somewhat challenging name on guitar, Kai Shishkevich. Welcome everyone to the second part of this session, Freedom from Fear. My name is Hedda Langemyr. I'm the director of the Norwegian Peace Council, umbrella organization for 22 peace organizations in Norway. I was fortunate to be interviewed by an amazing woman 3 years ago, and today I have the honor of introducing her to you. We're very lucky to have a very special woman among us. She's come all the way from the United States for this keynote session, Freedom from Fear. She's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers. She has received the Right Livelihood Award, widely known as the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, for developing an innovative model of truly independent, that's a big difference, grassroots political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded by mainstream media. She also received the Gandhi Peace Award for a significant contribution to the promotion of an enduring international peace. Amy Goodman is an award-winning investigative journalist, syndicated columnist, author, and of course, the host of Democracy Now!, an independent and global news broadcaster. Democracy Now! Currently broadcasts from more than 1,100 public televisions, radio, and internet stations around the world. Goodman is not only the famous host at Democracy Now!, but also a key figure in the development of the media station she herself initiated in 1996. The ways news are being broadcasted have changed a lot over the last years. Smaller media stations are forced to merge into large companies. The consequence of this development is mainstream media coverage. Our understanding of the world and what is happening out there is based on what these big fish put on the agenda. Democracy Now! Is not owned by a big company with interests to take care of. Democracy Now! Takes the viewpoints of people on the ground, activists who fight for freedom, and someone who can lift their struggle up, someone to cover their stories from their point of view and from their perspectives, someone who does that, and what, frankly speaking, every journalist should. She investigates. So all the way from the United States, the wonderful, one and only Amy Goodman. Welcome.
That was very nice. Thank you, Hedda, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here for a very important conference to talk about peace, to talk about freedom, to be a part of movements, because movements is what ultimately will make history, will determine the future. I originally come from Pacifica Radio. How many of you have heard of Pacifica in the United States? Well, it was founded more than 65 years ago in California, in Berkeley, founded by a war resister, a conscientious objector named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps after World War II, he said there has to be a media outlet that is run not by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. As George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA in Berkeley in 49. In 1959, KPFK in Los Angeles. My station in New York, WBAI, 1960. A station in Washington, WPFW. In 1970, 44 years ago, KPFT went on the air. That's one of the 5 Pacifica stations in Houston, Texas. Very significant. It's the Petro Metro. They went on the air, and within a few weeks, it's the only radio station in the United States that was blown off the air. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter, and they blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet, and the station went back on the air, the Klan blew it up again. I don't know whether it was the exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon. That's their title, as I often confuse them. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an aunt in Iraq, an uncle in Afghanistan, that breaks down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. It is our job to provide a forum for people to speak for themselves, and when they cannot tell their own story, to tell their story until they can tell their own. It is a great honor to be here in Oslo on this 50th anniversary of the address of the Nobel Peace Prize winner of 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King, who came here to Oslo in the midst of horror and trauma in the United States, as people were being gunned down, beaten, dogs set upon them for fighting for civil rights in the United States. Dr. King came here and said in his acceptance speech, "I accept the Nobel Prize for Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States of America are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. I accept this award on behalf of a civil rights movement which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger to establish a reign of freedom and a rule of justice." He said, "I'm mindful that only yesterday in Birmingham, Alabama, our children crying out for brotherhood were answered with fire hoses, snarling dogs, and even death. He said, I'm mindful that only yesterday in Philadelphia, Mississippi, young people seeking to secure the right to vote were brutalized and murdered. And only yesterday, more than 40 houses of worship in the state of Mississippi alone were bombed or burned because they offered a sanctuary to those who would not accept segregation. I'm mindful that debilitating and grinding poverty afflicts my people and chains them to the lowest rung of the economic ladder. He went on to say, the tortuous road which has led from Montgomery, Alabama to Oslo bears witness to the truth. This is a road over which millions of Negroes are traveling to find a new sense of dignity. And it's instructive to go back to Montgomery, Alabama, as we talk about the importance of movements when Dr. Martin Luther King was launched onto the national and global scene. It was because of a woman named Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, who on December 1st, 1955, sat down on a bus like many other passengers, but when a white passenger came over and wanted her to get up, and the bus driver told her to stand up, she refused. And in so doing, she launched the modern-day civil rights movement in the United States. In sitting down, she stood up not only for the rights of African Americans, but for the rights of everyone, because if one person is oppressed, we are all oppressed. It was December 1st. A few days later, December 5th, 55, she goes off to court, and the Montgomery Improvement Association has their meeting to decide how to deal, to lead a bus boycott, to desegregate the transportation system of Alabama, and they choose as their leader a young minister who had just moved into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Yes, it was Rosa Parks. Now, when Rosa Parks died a few years ago in Washington, D.C., we flew down to Washington, actually took a train, Democracy Now! Did, to cover the events leading up to her funeral in Detroit. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, and then her body was brought to a church where thousands came out. Oprah was inside, Cicely Tyson, the actress, many others, and loudspeakers were set up because thousands came outside to honor her. And of course, we were outside where it's often more interesting to hold those microphones, and we were asking people, why are you here? And we went up to a young college student, and she said, I emailed my professors this morning. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education. Now, I remember when we were taking the train down to Washington, D.C., you know, the reports were coming out. CNN was there, all the networks. And, of course, so many people know the story of Rosa Parks, so why, in a limited amount of time, tell her story again? Because they got it wrong. You know, that's our job, by the way, is not only to report on what's happening on the ground, we have an added responsibility to deconstruct what the corporate media presents so that people who have heard a story that they believe is true have a way to get to another reality, the reality of what's happening on the ground. So I remember CNN that day. They said, and they were hailing Rosa Parks, no question about it. They were saying Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. Oh, that's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a world-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. Rosa Parks was an organizer. She was an activist. The media denigrates activists. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP, you know, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He had worked with the greatest organizer of the 20th century in the United States, A. Philip Randolph, who went on to organize the 1963 March on Washington with Bayard Rustin, where Dr. King, a year before accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, gave his I Have a Dream speech. Yeah, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, African-American, gay pacifist, whose story needs to be known throughout the world, the people on the ground that organize to get so many people out that make history. So E.D. Nixon had worked with A. Philip Randolph, and he and Rosa Parks had been challenging the racist laws of the South for years. In fact, Rosa Parks had been to the Highlander Center, where black and white together had organized to strategize to change the laws. It's not just about heart, it's about dedicating your mind and heart to most effectively strategizing to change laws. Highlander Center, where Dr. King had been, where, Pete Seeger was. You know, Pete Seeger, the great singer and activist who recently died at the age of 94, told the story on Democracy Now! Of how he was just finishing up the song, We Shall Overcome, right? And he was singing, We Shall. He said there was an old folk song saying, we will, but you wanted to open the mouth so the people together singing would open their mouths together. And Dr. King came in as he was just putting the finishing touches on the song at the Highlander Center. And Dr. King listened, and the story goes, as he drove off in his car, he said to a friend in the car, that's a catchy tune. It became really the mantra, the song, the anthem of the civil rights movement. We need to know the stories of the organizers and the movements, because these moments don't just happen. Rosa Parks, in fact, had sat down on the bus before and refused to get up. Other young women had done the same. But this was the magic moment. You know, that moment when the earth shifts. You can never predict when that moment comes, but if you're involved with social change, you will determine history. You will change the world. And that's what happened that day. And to show how brave Rosa was, just go back a few months. As Dr. King was talking about a few years later, when Andrew Goodman, I'm close friends with his brother David, Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney, the three civil rights activists who had gone to Mississippi to help people to register to vote. Do you know that's something that in the United States today, those votes are being challenged in state after state? Poll taxes, where you have to pay to vote, were struck down long ago, but it's happening increasingly in the United States. The laws, for example, just recently, the Supreme Court said in Texas, yes, you must present a particularly official ID that many, particularly people who are poor or people of color, don't have. And they were saying, we're not going to rule on the justice of this, but we don't want to confuse people for this elections. And one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissenting decision said, this will disenfranchise perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. This is 2014. This is 50 years after Dr. King was here talking about people having their heads bashed in for organizing to get the right to vote. The movement for democracy does never know an end, and I hate to be pessimistic here. Every day we must fight for democracy and peace. A few months before Rosa Parks sat down to show her bravery, that was the summer of Emmett Till, the summer of a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till, sent him to Money, Mississippi, in the South in the summer to be safer, to be with his aunt and uncle and relatives. And he was ripped out of bed in the middle of the night by a white mob, and they tortured him, they beat him, and he ended up in the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago to his mother in a casket, she was incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. And so thousands of people streamed by his casket and saw, and then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they were actually published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of the people of the United States and around the world. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? The babies dead on the ground, a front page above the fold story in newspapers, the photographs and the headlines. We actually would learn this child's story, her name, which is what dignifies a life, and how she died, perhaps in Iraq. If every top story and every radio and TV newscast told the story of a woman with her legs blown off by a cluster bomb, or a Jones strike in Yemen or Pakistan. And we learn the story of, say, the wedding party. How did this happen? If we even saw, if on everyone's Facebook wall, if every tweet, every email talked about a soldier dead and dying for just 1 week, not only Americans, but people all over the world, citizens of the world, are compassionate. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. We need a media that tells the truth on the ground. And so today in 2014, as the US leads strikes once again on Iraq and Syria, bombing them, I guess the wisdom goes into peace. Or as Michael Franti, the great singer, said, into peace or into pieces. How is it that that is the answer to terror? We have to go back more than 10 years in Iraq. We have to go back to the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2002. You know, there was a media watch group, it's called FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, based in New York, and they did a study of the 2 weeks around Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, giving his push for war at the UN. That was February 5th, 2003. It was a critical speech, very important, because General Powell was seen as a person who was dragging his feet on war, and for him to say that the proof was in, that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, was the final nail in the coffin for so many. I just had the rare opportunity to introduce Noam Chomsky in the UN General Assembly. 800 people packed in, ambassadors all in the front row, and members of the public from around the world. And he gave a major address on the Middle East, and then I got to conduct a public interview and then take questions from this august audience of officials and people who were concerned about peace in the Middle East. Noam Chomsky is famous for saying the media manufactures consent for war all too often. So FAIR did the study, the 4 major nightly newscasts in the United States in the 2 weeks around Powell giving his push for war at the UN. In the United States, there were NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, and the Public Broadcasting News Hour. 2 weeks around Powell's address, there were 393 interviews done around war. Now, to go back to that time, in the United States, it was sort of half and half. Half the public was for war, half the public was against war. It's the critical time when people are trying to get information. You know, if they hear that a dictator has weapons of mass destruction, rightly, they're going to be concerned about their family or an imminent threat to the United States. They're hungry for information, and it's our responsibility in the media to dig deep and get to that information. So they looked at those 4 major nightly newscasts, the 2 weeks when the media is manufacturing consent, 393 interviews done around war. Guess how many were with peace leaders? Remember, half the population for and against war, 393 interviews done? 3. 3 interviews of almost 400 with anti-war leaders. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who are deeply concerned, as Dr. King was 50 years ago, about the growing inequality between rich and poor, those who are concerned about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. Dr. King in 1964 was talking about the civil rights movement in the United States. 3 years later, on April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, he gave a speech in New York at Riverside Church. It's often referred to as the Beyond Vietnam Address, why I oppose the war in Vietnam address. He was advised by his inner circle, by so many, do not give this speech. You have the President of the United States around your finger. At the time it was President Johnson. You got the Civil Rights Act passed. You got the Voting Rights Act passed. This war in Vietnam is not your war. Don't alienate the most powerful person on earth. And Dr. King refused to be silent, even separating himself from many in his own community. He said it is a seamless web, and he talked about the country he loved, the United States, and he said it's the greatest purveyor of violence on earth today. Incredibly brave speech at this time. He was castigated by the press. I just got a copy of Life magazine in that April of 1967 saying that Dr. King disservice to his cause, his country, his people. The Washington Post and other leading newspapers attacking him viciously. But he wouldn't stop in that last year of his life addressing the issue of war and peace. There's no more serious issue and decision a country can make than to go to war. On April 4th, 1968, he would be gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee. Why was he there? To organize garbage workers. He was there to stand with those who were holding these signs that said, "I am a man." He was there to help them organize a local of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Because he believed in dignity, he believed in human rights, and he believed deeply in peace, but in the deepest sense, which is not just the absence of war. It's about racial and economic justice. It is so much harder to wage peace than to wage war. Imagine if war were not an option. If it was just taken off the table. How do you resolve, for example, the conflict in the Middle East today? In the media in the United States, what do they do 10 years after this catastrophe, the US invasion of Iraq, bombing the cradle of civilization back to the cradle? Who does the media turn to? The New York Times, a few years after the invasion, they continually printed those front page stories by Judith Miller and Michael Gordon based on unnamed sources alleging weapons of mass destruction. They did do a piece. It was boxed on page, I think, 810, didn't name names. It said something like the New York Times in Iraq, and many people called it their mea culpa. I called it their kinda culpa. But to have a real effect, it should be on the front page of the newspapers of the New York Times, the paper of record, as many times as those pieces appeared alleging weapons of mass destruction, because that's what sinks into the consciousness of the population. So the media acknowledges that they may have gotten it wrong, but when we see the US again attacking Iraq, who do they turn to? Do they turn to the peace activists who got it right? Or do they turn to the cronies of the president at the time, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, William Crystal, Paul Bremer, who called himself the viceroy of Iraq. They're the ones who get the time on the networks and the space and the opinion pages to lay out what should happen today. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? We need a media that gives voice to the movements. It is critical for all of us to ensure that there is a media that goes to where the silence is. In 2008, in the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, at the Republican convention in St. Paul, Democracy Now! Covers all the conventions. We were there when President Obama was nominated in Denver, and then we went to the convention in St. Paul. And it was a beautiful blue sky day. These are supposed to be celebrations of democracy. And we covered the raging anti-war movement then, which hasn't changed, it's just taken different positions. And these movements need a voice. The Occupy movement, for those who say it, got eviscerated and what kind of effect did it have, they're deeply mistaken if they think that it was destroyed. I mean, to have a movement that changed the language throughout the world, everyone knows what Occupy means now. And I'm not talking about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, though it is absolutely critical to challenge the media and express what's happening on the ground there as well. But the Occupy movement and the term 99% and 1%, just to change the conversation, is the beginning of the challenging of what that is expressing. But there we were covering the peace movement in Denver as well as in St. Paul. Thousands of people marched for peace, and interestingly, they were led by soldiers, US soldiers who'd been to Iraq and Afghanistan, the ones that aren't interviewed. They were wearing their uniforms, full military regalia, taking great risk to say war is not the answer. It was a peaceful protest. Thousands marched. We covered them. I raced off to the convention floor to interview the delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska, where Sarah Palin was from. She had just been nominated by John McCain. And with my colleague, Rick Rowley, the great cinematographer who, with Jeremy Scahill, former Democracy Now! Producer, made the film Dirty Wars, and I hope you all see it, the Oscar-nominated film about drone attacks and the secretive wars waged by JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, from Somalia to Afghanistan to Pakistan. So there we were interviewing delegates, and then I get a call, come quickly to the corner of 7th and Jackson in St. Paul. I didn't know this city because Nicole and Sharif have been arrested. They're two of our colleagues, reporters at Democracy Now! I said, what are you talking about? There's a peaceful protest. They went off to prepare the TV show for tomorrow. They said, no, come quickly. They've been arrested and bloodied by the police. We raced off from the convention floor. We had all the security credentials that allow us to interview presidents, vice presidents, delegates, but we race off to this corner. We see that the riot police have fully contained the area. I ran up to them to get my colleagues released. And I stopped at one of the officers and I said, I want to speak to your commanding officer. 2 of our reporters have just been arrested. It wasn't seconds before they ripped me through that police line, twisted my arms back, handcuffed me, pulled me through the police line, threw me against a wall onto the ground, charging me with interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. I'm looking desperately for Sharif and Nicole. Now, understand, Sharif Abdel-Qaddous is our reporter now covering the Egyptian revolution. I hope all of you go to democracynow.org or check out Radio Nova if you live here. Radio Nova, 6 and 6, Monday through Friday, 6 in the morning, 6 in the evening. Wonderful to have independent media throughout the world, also broadcasting what are the different places, Radio Revolt in Trondheim, as well as student radio in Bergen. As we bring together independent media to provide a voice for the majority of people. But there is Sharif, who now reports from Egypt. He wasn't arrested under Mubarak, but there he is getting arrested in the United States as he's covering what's supposed to be a celebration of democracy.
I can't find Nicole anywhere, Nicole Salazar, but I see Sharif across the parking lot. I demand to be brought to him. I'm brought in my handcuffs to him. His arm is bleeding. We're demanding to be released, and the Secret Service pulled the credentials off of our necks. They rip them off. I'm then brought into a police wagon. I find Nicole. Her face is bleeding. She is handcuffed. I said, Nicole, what happened? And she described what happened. She said they were in the TV studio. They heard a commotion. They raced down, she and Sharif. I just have 2 minutes, so I'm going to speak super fast. And she said she started filming. She didn't plan to film her own violent arrest, but there was the riot police coming at her, shouting, on your face, on your face. She didn't know what hit her. In front of her and behind her, the police took her down on her face. Her camera tumbled down. They pulled the battery out of the camera, if you were wondering what they wanted to stop happening. Sharif, a very cool guy, told the rioting police to calm down. They threw him up against a wall, kicked him twice in the chest, took him down, bloodying his arm. They said they would face felony riot charges, not the police, but the reporters. I was taken to the police garage where they erected the cages to put the protesters in. Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. There was such an outcry over the arrest of reporters, and they arrested more than 40 reporters that week. But a few hours later, I was released, and then Nicole and Sharif were, and I was brought back to the convention center. The networks wanted to interview me. I was in the NBC skybox, and after the interview, the NBC reporter came over and said, I don't understand what happened. He said, why wasn't I arrested? I said, were you outside covering the protest? He said, no. I said, well, that's the thing. I don't get arrested in the skybox either, right? It's our job to get out in the streets as well. We've got to cover those in power. We've got to cover inside the convention, the corporations that sponsor the conventions for all the parties. And we got to get out into the streets where thousands of people are, the uninvited guests. They have something important to say as well. Democracy is a messy thing, but it's our job to capture it all, and we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. As we left St. Paul, we ultimately sued the police and the Secret Service, an unprecedented lawsuit that led to a major settlement, and we decided to hold a news conference to send the message to police and to protesters who were wrongfully arrested. Where could we go where there would be the largest gathering? This had taken a few years to achieve this settlement. We went into the middle of Occupy Wall Street, Zuccotti Park. That's what was happening at the time. We knew there would be hundreds of police there who would hear this message that, you know, arresting the messenger is not acceptable. Killing the messenger, of course, even worse. And I think particularly of the Arab journalists and media workers in places like Iraq who met their death there, like Mazen Dana, who is a great Palestinian videographer working for Reuters who happened to be outside of Abu Ghraib, and when the US soldiers killed him, they were saying on their walkie-talkies, we engaged a cameraman. I think of Tariq Ayoub, who on April 8th, 2003, the day before Baghdad fell, you know, the statue of Saddam Hussein came down in Firdos Square, pulled down by US soldiers. Tariq Ayoub, a young reporter for Al Jazeera, went up on the roof to set the camera angle and was making his way down when the US military, which started that morning by strafing Abu Dhabi TV as the hosts on television were begging for help, then moved on to the Al Jazeera headquarters in Baghdad. Tariq Ayoub was killed. And then the US military on that day, just a few hours later, took aim at the Palestine Hotel where hundreds of unembedded reporters were from all over the world. Taras Pratsiuk, a cameraman for Reuters, and Jose Coso, a cameraman for Telecinco in Spain, were on their balconies just filming what was happening in Baghdad that day. And they were killed. Tariq Ayoub's wife, Dima Taboub, at the funeral for her husband said, hate breeds hate. Who's engaged in terrorism now? We need a media that brings out the truth on the ground so people all over the world can make decisions about how we all want to live. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. Anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women who can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to make the decisions, to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Democracy now. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for a very inspirational speech. All of us that work with peace-related issues in everyday life need this type of inspiration. It is quite a hell from time to another. It also seems that democracy now, everything needs to happen so fast all the time. We never have enough time. We should have had a much longer speech by you here tonight, for instance. We don't have the time, and then sometimes we feel that the work for peace seems quite impossible within the frames that we operate in our lives. But I just want to quote then the previous Nobel Peace Prize winner, Fridtjof Nansen, who said, "Peace is not impossible, it just takes a little more time." And that's the time we need in our common struggle for a more peaceful world in the time to come. So thank you very much for coming. Amy will be with us downstairs for the coming half an hour or so she's open for questions, signing books, etc. Thanks again, and all the best for the rest of the conference. Thanks.